Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to possibly be doing the final Aeldari tier list of the index. So as you guys know, in 2025 we are going to be getting a new codex early on in the edition, and I'm not sure there's going to be that many pivotal changes come December with the new balanced data slate that is going to change the Aeldari fundamentally. So this might actually be our last tier list. Now we've gotten several points decreases, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of do another one of these for you guys and kind of give you an overview of what I think about each and every unit, their strengths, their weaknesses, where they fit into the meta, etc. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. Let me go ahead and explain the tiers for you real quick, just so we can kind of get settled in here. S tier, of course, is the best units of the index. They are included in a vast majority of the Eldar armies and are considered invaluable. A tier units are exceptionally effective at their role, and they appear in most Eldari lists as well, but they're not considered as mandatory or as necessary in some builds. B tier units are really good flex options that are good in some builds, but struggle to find their place in every Eldari build. C tier units are generally considered bad at what they do or just not great. I would say kind of on the side of mediocre, and they don't find their place in a lot of lists, but can still be fun and are still useful. They still have useful abilities in some situations. D tier units, of course, are the worst of the index, and I guess, you guys can guess what I'll probably put in here, but they are, of course, pretty much unusable, and there are much better options, even in their intended role. So, having said that, let us go ahead and dive in. First, we of course have the great Azurman, or Assman as I like to call him, and Azurman, I can't wait for the new model of this guy, but Azurman is pretty good, and I would consider him actually an A tier unit. Now, the reason being, he's obviously not going to be in every Eldari build, but you have been seeing him here and there in competitive lists that have done well, in GTs and so forth. And that is because he is a monster himself, right? Allows his unit, first of all, free Overwatch. Next, 3 plus invulnerable save, and a very powerful melee weapon, strength 6, devastating wounds, AP minus 3, I believe, on the weapon. He just hits like a truck, an absolute truck. His ranged weapons aren't great, but they're basically damage to Avenger Shuriken catapults. So, they can take out a few Marines, chip some damage on a vehicle, so forth. And he works really well with Dire Avengers. I think he's overshadowed by the fact that Dire Avengers aren't great, but, Dire Avengers are a decent unit. They're just not the best unit out there, and we'll talk about that when we get to that unit. But pretty solid. I would definitely call him an A tier model. And the 3 of Moonville save, it might not seem like much, but with the Fate die system that we have, and, you could roll a bunch of 3s initially when you roll your first 6 dice. This guy having a 3-up invul save means that those Fate dice will go to good use. Okay, next up is the Autarch on foot, and we're going to put him in S tier. So, up until recently, I would not have done this, but they've recently changed his Superlative Strategist ability so that it actually works. It actually reduces the CP cost of an ability that he uses on himself or his unit once per round, which is awesome. It means you can put him in Storm Guardians, get a free Overwatch, get a free Matchless Agility, get a free Lightning Reflexes. It really just umps up the CP generation and, viability of this model, and really makes him efficient at generating and managing command points. There's other tricks you can do with them. You can put them in a Guardian Defender squad, have the Bright Lance platform, pop out of cover, shoot something with Overwatch, and then pop back in. Also a really good strategy there. He comes with grenades. You can get a free grenade if you want to. He gives the unit fights first, which is really good with Storm Guardians against, a lot of the mid-tier units he's going to be fighting against early on in the game. And he's just a powerhouse. You can still give him things like the Phoenix Gem if you wanted to. He's much cheaper than the alternative Wayleaper. So there's a lot of reasons why this guy is so good. And I've actually started exclusively using this guy in most lists that I put together for balanced competitive play. He's just a really good model. And yeah, he doesn't have the movement of the Autarch Wayleaper, but since the nerfs to secret missions, I don't think the Wayleaper is as of an auto include as he was before. I know a lot of people still use the Wayleaper, and don't get me wrong, Wayleaper with Phoenix Gem, still fantastic, still great. We're probably still going to put him in S tier, but I just think he has some competition now. And personally, for my play style, after the changes, I've been using the Autarch on foot way more. And that's normally because I use Storm Guardians and, Guardian Defenders and things like that. I think if you're not using those models, it's probably better to just still go with the Wayleaper. But if you're using Guardian units, then you definitely want to give this guy consideration. All right, moving on to the Skyrunner. And I think the Skyrunner is A tier. And here's my reasoning behind this. Do you see him in a lot of lists? No, you don't, because there's frankly better options, right? The Autarch on foot, the Autarch on foot and the Skyrunner, or the Wayleaper, are both way better than this guy. But this guy is interesting because he can actually generate CP from reserve. And that's something GW never changed, they never fixed. So in my mind, it must be something that's intended. If they went ahead and fixed the Autarch on foot, but they never fixed the Skyrunner, then it's probably an intended feature, right? So I think he's A tier because of that. You can simply put him in reserve, safely farm CP. He's not going to be in every list, but he's still an Autarch, and he still hits pretty hard. Weirdly enough, I was checking his datasheet the other day, and he has a laser lance that has AP -3. Again, don't know if that's intended or not, but in the latest update, latest updated index, right from the GW website, AP -3 laser lance in melee. So pretty decent. He hits pretty hard. You can put him in strategic reserve and have him come in on a board edge later on in the game. He can do some work there. He's not bad. And again, he is cheaper than the Wayleaper option. So there is that. I think the failings of this guy, obviously, and why he's not that great is because, when compared to the other two, no Howling Banshee Mask, Manda Blasters, so he can't get either of those options. And he really only has one weapon that he can choose, either a Howling Banshee Blade, Laser Lance, or Fusion Gun, which, you're never going to pick the Fusion Gun, let's be real here. The Laser Lance is going to be your go-to each and every time. It's just better than the other two options. So my thoughts on him are either he's going to get a new kit, or they're going to just erase him from the index or codex when the codex comes out. And I've thought this for a while. People have been holding on hope, but I really do think he's just going to get wiped out, unfortunately. If they don't give him a new model, I think he's done for. Hopefully not, crossing my fingers. Okay, next up is the Autarch Wayleaper. Of course, S tier, right? Again, my personal taste is now the Foot Farseer, or Foot Autarch, just because he's so much better at generating and managing CP for you. But the Wayleaper's still really good. His bubble of +1 leadership is great for Battle Shock in the backfield, and he's very mobile, so he can get to places quickly on the battlefield. Which, is not to be scoffed at, right? If you need something that can fire a fusion gun and then assault in the mid-board, turns 4, turns 3, turns 5, later on in the game, this is your boy. And he can do pretty good, right? If somebody charges him, he has fights first, which is also really effective. So, still a good model. You're typically going to either give him the Phoenix Gem or not. There's not really any other options. You can give him Fate's Messenger, but I think Fate's Messenger is better off for the Foot Autarch or something like that. I really don't think the Wayleaper wants that too much. It's better than nothing, I suppose, but at the same time, it doesn't often do that much for him, and I would argue that you're better off just spending the points on the Phoenix Gem for this guy, making him 150, but also making him a considerable threat in your army. So yeah, still S tier, we all know it. Generates CP every turn, which is great, and is just an awesome tech piece and offensive and defensive model. Next up, we have the Avatar of Khaine, and of course the Avatar of Khaine has to be S tier, right? It's one of the most powerful models, not only in our index, but in the game. It's very tough. With the synergies that Eldar have, it's even better, with auto 6s to Overwatch, with, great toughness, with the ability to have fortune on him. He's just an absolute monster in combat, at range, and he's extremely durable. He does have one weakness, however, of course, it's mortal wounds. But most units in the Avatar's class, unless they have like some sort of feel no pain, are weak against mortal wounds. So again, unless it's something that has feel no pain, it's going to be weak against mortal wounds, and that's the Avatar of Khaine in a nutshell. There's nothing you can do about it. If you know your opponent has a lot of mortals, keep the Avatar away, keep him safe, keep him screened. Other than that, there's not much you can do. So, yeah, Avatar of Khaine, enough said, really good model, and a staple in a ton of competitive Eldari lists. Next up, we have a Phoenix Lord again, Baharroth. Baharroth is going to be A tier. Now, he's not suitable for all builds, but I think if you're running Baharroth with 10 Hawks, I think that's really good. You throw Guide on him, fish for those lethals, and he does consistent chip damage against both tough targets and, of course, against lighter targets. He absolutely mulches them. If you're going against something like Imperial Guard, you're going against, maybe some Ogrins or something like that that don't have a great save, this unit can absolutely mulch right through them. Alternatively, if you're going against Nids, they have some warriors, or they have, some models that are, higher toughness, but maybe a lower armor save, like a 3+, or maybe in some cases even a 4+ in cover. 2s and 1s failing, forcing a bunch of lethal hits, that's pretty awesome. I think Baharroth does have a lot of play in competitive lists. We've seen Baharroth to 10 Hawks in competitive GT lists, but we just don't see him in every single GT list, and that's why he's probably more of an A tier model. He's really not that good on his own. He's not that good with 5 Hawks. He really needs that certain build to make him good, but in that build, he is very effective. As far as his damage output goes, I also think it's kind of weak. Just on his own, he has a weak damage output, but his ability to move 6 inches with his unit after shooting, just like Shadow Specters and Scourges, is a really awesome ability and shouldn't be underestimated. Okay, next up is the Cobra. And the Cobra is our super heavy tank. Now, I'm going to put the Cobra... I got to put it in C tier. Now, the reason being, the Cobra isn't bad. If you look at the Cobra and you build a list around it, I think it can actually be pretty good. But the problem is it's a super heavy vehicle. There are armies that can, deep strike within 3 inches and just plug them in one turn and just kill him out. I know that he's pretty durable for an Eldar super heavy or an Eldar vehicle, but it's not that durable. So there are ways to kill this thing. It's a huge chunk of points. It's like 400 something points. I think you're just better off getting, more mileage out of things like the Avatar of Khaine and stuff like that. Now, there is one exception. I do believe that the counterpart to the Cobra, which we'll talk about in a second, is a little bit higher on the list. And, that's essentially because I think it has a better special role, better weapon, and stuff like that. And I think it does better in competitive play than this thing. But the D-Rift ability itself, I also don't really care for because it's only a 3-inch ability. So if you guys don't know, basically when this thing shoots its main gun, its D-Impaler, or whatever it is, it also is able to roll the dice against every enemy unit within 3 inches of it. And if that unit rolls a 5, or if you roll a 5+ or something like that against that unit, you do D3 mortal wounds to it. And again, it's like something it's cool if you can get those 5+, but when are you realistically going to have a situation like that where there's 2 or 3 units that you're rolling against that are going to be, suffering mortal wounds? It's just not a situation that pops up that much. So, I really don't like the ability of this thing, and it's generally just not a good model. It's very swingy as well. Its attacks, I think it gets D6 plus 3 attacks, so, you could get that high 9, or you could just simply get, 4 and just do nothing that turn. So I'm really not convinced that it's a good model in competitive play, but it's super fun, right? I mean, you could run it in, casual lists, and I think it'd be pretty good, especially with the right buffs. You throw Guide on there, you throw, Fortune on it, and it can be pretty good. You make sure it can fire and fade and stuff like that. Of course, it is kind of hard to move around, but, it's kind of just going to be sitting in the backfield anyway for the most of the game. So, Yeah, that's where the Cobra is sitting for me. All right, next up, we have Corsair Void Reavers, and I actually think these guys are much better than they were before. Their price point is good now at 60. I think these guys are an A tier unit. I think probably on the lower end of A tier. I don't think they're good in every build, but having a unit for 60 points that can scout up the battlefield, be put in a Wave Serpent, allow the Wave Serpent to scout up, allow you to, be able to take more skimmers in your army. I think that warrants some, some notion, some respect, to be honest. So, yeah, I think these guys are pretty good. They can take power weapons, which are decent at killing Space Marines. Squad of these guys can kill about 3 Space Marines on a turn, on average, which is great. That allows them to trade up against several Space Marine units. They're only 65 points. A lot of Space Marine units are 80 plus. So if they can, kind of go in there, score an objective, or, take out another unit on the battlefield and prevent them from doing anything, I think that's a plus. Plus, they have OC2, so they can easily take objectives away from opponents by simply just, again, moving up, shooting. By the way, they get rerolls to hit against units on objectives, which is excellent. And then charging in, getting all those rerolls, and yeah, they will kill 3, maybe even sometimes 4 Marines. And the Marines striking back, may or may not actually do anything back to them. Well, not enough anyway to stop them from being able to take the objective from you. Let's put it that way. So, yeah, definitely like those, and I think they're going to be considered more in lists. I think the only reason you won't see these guys too much is because we still have units like Rangers, right? They compete with Rangers, they compete with striking Scorpions, and it's really going to be a choice as if you want more damage or you want more utility, then you're going to go with the Rangers for more utility. You're going to go with the Scorpions for more damage. But I do think being in the middle, being an OC2 unit versus an OC1 unit, does have its merits. So I do like the Void Reavers a lot. As for their counterparts, the Void Scarred, I actually don't think these guys are as good. I know they got a points buff recently, but I'm going to put these guys in B tier. I think they're decent, at least decent enough. Their ability gives them lethal hits and also precision, which is nice. But overall, I just don't think they're as good as the Void Reavers being able to reroll all hits against enemy units on an objective, or just reroll ones to hit normally. I think lethal hits is nice, but again, you're going to want to take these guys because of how they're pointed and because of how the options for them kind of roll out. You're going to want to take these guys in units of 10 so you can include all the options in the squad. And at that point, they're really expensive. They're 160 points for 10 of them, which is pretty insane if you, consider that's more expensive than any of other aspect warriors aside from shining spears and some of the more expensive ones. I mean, they're almost as expensive as a squad of 10 fire dragons, for God's sakes, right? So when you think about them in that context, they just don't sell me for really competitive play. But they're a really good unit in semi-competitive play. You can put these guys in a Wave Serpent, put your Rain in them, put the Visarch in them, and they're a really powerful, hard-hitting unit. I think, obviously Refrain and the Visarch are better with Harlequins, but I still think they're really cool thematically with Corsairs, and I think they could still do really well. Okay, moving on to the Crimson Hunter. So we got the Crimson Hunter here, and the Crimson Hunter is one of those models that was really good in the probably kind of middle of the edition. But now the meta has shifted away from things that the Crimson Hunter I think is effective against, and the synergies are not as many with the Incarn, because of course the Incarn got nerfed as well several times throughout the edition. So I think the the Crimson Hunter is a B tier unit. And honestly, I think it's still good. I think it's still usable, very usable. If people like Crimson Hunters, I think they're still good. They can still punch up, and they can still do good damage, really good damage against flyers and stuff like that, things that fly, without a doubt. But I just don't think they hit hard enough against targets they need to in the current meta, and that's all. And this is what I've noticed myself, is coming in with a Crimson Hunter, going after some artillery in the background, or, trying to pop a Rhino or something like that. Yeah, they can usually pop that model, but sometimes you don't roll as well, and sometimes you have to use fate dice to be able to do it. And I just think there's better ways of, at least more efficient ways of killing those models. Like, Falcons, for example, are more efficient at killing for their points in Crimson Hunters. You know, also fire dragons are more efficient points wise for killing transports and stuff like that. So really, I just think that the Crimson Hunter is still good. I just think it gets a little bit outcompeted by some of the other options now that they're cheaper. So yeah, Crimson Hunter still a great model. Again, it's really cool as well. It looks really awesome. If you're going against a lot of, people in your local meta that have flyers, or you really need something in your list that can just pop something with fly like Necrons, oh, this thing is great against Necrons, guys. If you have an opponent that's, running some Doomsday arcs or something like that, that could be really good. Running some Annihilation barges, the Crimson Hunter will absolutely destroy those models. But in other cases, I just don't think it's as efficient. Okay, so next up is Dark Reapers. Dark Reapers, I actually think are A tier. Now, a lot of people will argue with this because Dark Reapers did get a nerf, but I find that they're still good. And here's the thing, do they kill their points worth when they shoot every single turn? No, they don't. And they're not supposed to be used this way. The best way to use Dark Reapers, and I'll say this again, is to use them in ruins, right? Stay behind ruins in the beginning of the game, shoot their indirect fire, soften up enemy targets, and basically it's like this, right? If you're wondering how you can get a squad of Scorpions or Howling Banshees to fully kill a Space Marine squad so that you can consolidate into another unit afterward and not be, bogged down in combat, or excuse me, bogged down and trying to figure out how to bog down an enemy in combat, the Dark Reapers are actually really good at softening up these targets for you before you jump in. So to give you an example, the Exarch's weapon, the Tempest Launcher, is not going to do a ton of damage. It's maybe going to ping off one, maybe two wounds off a target, but sometimes that's just enough to be able to allow your Scorpions and Banshees to get a decisive victory against your opponent. So they work really well by synergizing with those units so that you can win those engagements more convincingly and more reliably. So, a lot of players will just straight up say, well, these guys aren't good against Marines. The Tempest Launcher only kills like one, maybe two Space Marines when it shoots. And oftentimes you're not even going to kill one, right? You're just going to get like a wound off of it. And that's totally reasonable to say. But again, this is consistent damage over the course of the entire game. These guys are, likely going to be alive for multiple turns. They're not a trading unit. So throughout the game, they're going to be able to soften targets for you, ping off a wound here, ping off a wound there, so that your other models can be more efficient against them. And the chances of you leaving something on one wound, which, by the way, guys, it happens all the time, especially with Bright Lances and stuff like that, because Bright Lances have 8 damage. There's so many vehicles in the game that either have 9 wounds or they have 13 wounds. So it's like, you're kind of on that cusp of 2 Bright Lances not being quite enough to kill something at 13 wounds sometimes, and 1 Bright Lance not being able to, punch through the fate dice against, 9 wound targets sometimes. So having something that can, do a wound here and there before you jump in and do it, and even a couple of these guys, right? A couple of squads of these guys can shoot at the same target, really soften them up, definitely deal a couple of wounds to that enemy unit. And then your unit that's going in there, whether it be your Howling Banshees, your Shining Spears, your Striking Scorpions, whatever, can kill it more reliably. And even against light vehicles, right? If you're going against something that is, that you need 6s to wound against, yeah, maybe you don't get the wound on it, but you could, and it could help you a little bit by doing that. Or, alternatively, if you have line of sight, the Dark Reapers can definitely chip some damage off of something, right? They have strength 8 weapons, damage 2, ignores cover. The regular Dark Reapers can get the job done. And that's often what it's going to be, right? Something moves into the midfield. You can move your Dark Reapers from terrain out into the open, shoot at that unit, get a few wounds off of it, and then your other units can deal with the decisive blow, right? Your War Walkers, your Falcons, stuff like that. Again, I don't think Dark Reapers are good in every single list, but I do still think they're good, even for 85 points. I personally think they should be about 80, just because of the nerfs to indirect fire. I don't think that was necessary that they got bumped up to 85, but they're still good for what they are. They're still an effective unit, and you're still going to see lists bringing units of Dark Reapers from time to time in competitive play. All right, next up, Death Jester. And I think the Death Jester is S tier. Now I have one big issue about the Death Jester. I actually think it's closer to A tier than a lot of these other S tier models. And that is simply due to one fact, right? That is because when you roll with this thing, with the Fate's Messenger and everything like that, this thing will cost about 105 points for you with the Fate's Messenger, which is pretty cheap considering what it can potentially do. But what I find is that when I roll my 3 dice and I'm looking for those 6s, there's only about a 50% chance you actually get a 6 in there. So let's say you don't get a 6, you just get 3 hits and you change 1 to a 6. You're getting approximately 6 attacks. Now, if you get 6 attacks 50% of the time, 50% of the game, that's a coin flip. It's just not going to be that great. Versus 9 attacks, you're looking at a whole different set of math. You're looking at a whole different, set of, kind of abilities, I should say, being able to stack devastating wounds and then being able to, potentially force a battle shock test because you're killing more models or killing models now instead of like maybe not killing models. I think that's a big deal. And I've had games with this guy where he's done so well. I've just rolled 6s after 6s after 6s. And like every turn I'm rolling a 6 for his dice. And I'm getting like 9 to 12 attacks on him and life is good. And then I've had games where I'm not rolling 6s. I'm rolling, kind of the average dice. I'm maybe getting 6 attacks here with the Fate's Messenger. And then I'm rolling to wound, and I'm only like wounding 4 or 3 of them. And it's like, maybe I kill 1 Space Marine. So there's situations that he just sucks when you roll bad, right? Like he's really a model that relies on rolling 6s. And if you're not rolling hot, if you're not rolling those 6s, he's not going to do that well. So, having said that, though, he's still a lone operative. He's still good at, taking out or, achieving the lone operative kind of stuff, like objectives and things like that. He can score on objectives. He can sit on an objective and score for you, with the proper screening as long as your opponent doesn't have anything to take him out. And he's great. I think he's still a great model. Even just being a lone op himself is good enough for A tier, being at the price point that he's at. But you add on the damage that he can potentially deal, and he becomes S tier. It's just that sometimes he feels a little bit disappointing with the damage output that he can, put out. But again, that's just my experience over the last couple months using the Death Jester, kind of not rolling the 6s with him. By the way, I've had games with this guy in the beginning of the edition where he was blowing through and like almost killing Chaos Knights, right? Like he was doing enough damage to little baby knights that were just wrecking them, almost destroying them in one blow. And there were some really good rolls involved in that, but, again, that's not always going to be the case. Okay, next up is Dire Avengers. Dire Avengers I actually think are probably more B tier. And, don't get me wrong, I think they're okay. I just think that for the points, they're 70 points. They get a 5+ Overwatch. They're really good into some factions. Like, they're really good into orcs. They're really good into, factions with low armor saves. They're really good into other Eldar. They're good into Dark Eldar. They're good into Sisters because, only 1 wound apiece. But what they're not really great into is the vast majority of Space Marine factions. And that's where you kind of lose me because most people just fight Space Marines nowadays. I mean, even in the tournament scene, guys, like a vast majority of the armies that you're going to be going against are some flavor of Space Marines. So when you have Dire Avengers, they're a good unit. I think they're actually really good at stopping Deep Strikers behind you, for example, because you can put them on your home objective. You only need 1 model there to be able to use the 4+ Overwatch, which is what they get when they're on objectives. And you can do some significant damage to Deep Strikers, like Grey Knights coming in with like, a strike squad or something like that behind you using the 3-inch Deep Strike. You blast them with a squad of 10 Dire Avengers with Guide, and they're saving on a 3-up because they're not in terrain because, it's your backfield. You have full line of sight on them. They're going to take some hits. They're going to take some casualties, and they're not going to be able to trade that well. So not only are they, kind of wasting their CP, but, they're not going to be able to deal the damage that they wanted to deal, which is a big, which is a big deal, right? It's a big thing. So Dire Avengers situationally are good, and that's why I put them in B tier, but they're not good in every circumstance. They're not good in every competitive army, and especially when they're not run with the Zerman. Sometimes they can kind of fall flat a little bit, but I still think they're decent. Again, if you're in a meta that has a lot of Grey Knights, a lot of 3-inch deep strike and stuff like that, I think they can be really good, especially for defending your backfield and, kind of in that sort of role. I don't think they're as good on middle objectives just because, in the beginning of the edition, I thought they were fine because Eldar were so strong anyway that even if the Dire Avengers died, chances were a lot of your other units were going to be able to just pick up whatever, kind of went after the Dire Avengers. But nowadays, I just don't think they do as well on the mid board. I think they're better, in the early game at least, when your opponent's deep striking stuff, protecting your backfield, and then later on in the game, moving up to the mid board to be able to provide support for you. But, I just think they're mostly a situational unit, and that's why I went ahead and put them in B tier here. Okay, Eldrad. Let's talk about Eldrad. Eldrad, I'm going to also put him in B tier. And there's only really one reason for this. It's because he's kind of expensive at 110 points. Mind War's good, but what I found is that without the 7-inch Phantasm, like kind of safety maneuver that, was available in the past, earlier in the edition, he just doesn't do as well at mind warring people. So you can't just run him solo, I feel, which is what I was doing. I was having a lot of success just throwing this guy in reserve, getting the extra fate dice, and then just coming out of reserve, frying a character with mind war, and then like phantasming back behind a wall. And he was really hard to deal with like that. But you can't really do that as much because he has a larger base. So Phantasm's not as good on him. And, Mind War's still good, but if Eldrad dies for 110 points after doing it, it's often not going to be that worth it. Doom is also pretty good, but it requires line of sight on an enemy unit, and that's sometimes also hard to get, especially with the Pry Nexus terrain layouts being more dense. However, situationally, I think Doom is fantastic. I think Doom is really good against Orc armies, for example. I think Eldrad is really good against Orcs. Personally, just because of the fact that you can Mind War the Pain Boy out of the unit right away, get rid of that Feel No Pain, then Doom the unit, giving them +1 to wound, and then, units like Dire Avengers, Wind Riders, or whatever else you have in your army can just clean up house, right? Can just eliminate the entire unit. So this is really good against things like Bully Boys, that are going to be running, maybe running excuse me, not Bully Boys, what am I talking about? Green Tide, right? Where you have a ton of Orc Boys and you have units like character units like Pain Boys and stuff like that handing out Feel No Pain. Maybe against Bully Boys, against Mega Knobs, a +1 to wound would help. Wind Riders and stuff like that, be able to punch through that toughness 6 that they have. So yeah, I guess in a way it's decent against Bully Boys too, depending on what else you have in the list. But yeah, I think Eldrad has a lot of applications for that Doom ability, but I just think he's more niche. I don't think he's going to be good in every Eldar list against every opponent. I think he has his strengths against certain armies, and then against a lot of armies that maybe don't character spam as much, or maybe have tougher characters with invulnerable saves and, or really good armor saves. Like, I just don't think his Mind War really gets the job done. So yeah, that's where I stand on Eldrad. I think he's decent. I think he's good situationally, but I don't think he's good in every single list. Okay, next up is the Falcon. And the Falcon, ladies and gentlemen, with the buffs, definitely S tier. I thought this thing was S tier before. It was great. Fire support, allowing you to reroll wounds, is awesome. It allows you to hit much harder with things like Striking Scorpions, Fire Dragons, Howling Banshees. Pretty much anything that you can fit in there is going to become vastly more efficient. The Falcon is 130 points now. Comes with a Pulse Laser, a Bright Lance, and a Shuriken Cannon. It's a great gunboat. And it has deep strike, so it's actually really decent rapid ingressing. Now, I don't personally rapid ingress this thing, but I think if you're running a lot of them, if you're running triple Falcon, or you're running, some Wave Serpents and triple Falcon, might be worth it to rapid ingress one of them, especially on some terrain layouts where you don't have room to deploy all three. And that's crucial, right? If you don't have room to deploy them all, you definitely want to use one in reserve and rapid ingress. So I think that just kind of puts it over the top when it comes to its ability to, be adaptable to the different terrain layouts that exist in Pride Nexus. Falcons are reasonably durable. I mean, they're not that durable, but they're fast. They have the ability also, which is, in my opinion, really cool, to kind of be able to tackle models that are much higher points and actually potentially kill them with the pulse laser and the rerolls that it gets. And on top of it, you can put characters in it in addition to aspect warders. The 6 transport capacity allows you to put things like the Death Jester. Now the Death Jester can come out of a transport, reroll wounds against something, and get many, many more devastating wounds, which is really good. You can have things like a Zerman in there for the same reasons. Kahandra's in there for the same reasons, right? It just, not only is it a huge damage multiplier, but it's a good model in its own right. Okay. Next up is the Farseer on foot. Also, I think an S tier unit. And the reason being is because the Farseer on foot works great with a number of units in our army. Guardian Defenders works pretty well with them too. Farm some Fate dice, turn those Fate dice into a 6. Overwatch with that Brightlands platform. Overwatch with the nearby, Avatar of Cain or whatever you have there. And you get an auto 6. That's always good. But also Fortune is always good. Using it on things like the Avatar of Cain, making it super durable. Using it on stuff like Wraithguard, Wraithblades. It is just an immensely powerful ability, and that's why I think the Farseer belongs in S tier. As for the Farseer Skyrunner, also think it's S tier. I don't think, though, that the Farseer Skyrunner is used as much because of the fact that units like Wind Riders aren't really used as much as things like the Avatar of Cain, which is, basically synonymous. The Farseer on foot is synonymous with things like support weapons, Avatar of Cain, Wraithblades, Wraithguard, those, classic quote-unquote triple threat Eldar lists. You're going to want a Farseer on foot in there. You're not necessarily going to want a Skyrunner, although a Skyrunner is still good in those types of lists. It's just easier to protect a Farseer on foot because you'll have Guardians in that list as well. All right, so the Guardians can kind of soak up any hits that the Farseer would normally take. But I still think the Farseer Skyrunner is great. I love the Farseer Skyrunner because I love Wind Riders, and he makes Wind Riders so good with Guide that it's almost criminal. And being able to guide something that is then going to overwatch an enemy like a squad of 10 Dire Avengers or a unit of Wind Riders. By the way, everybody is kind of afraid of Achillans nowadays. Now, I will say this, and I'll probably make a video on this later on, real quick, but Achillans got nerfed, guys. GW just came out in their Worlds tournament, and they said Achillans do not have the ability to shoot their servo sentry and then still fire off a grenade. They also don't have the ability to rapid ingress using their 3-inch deep strike. If they use 3-inch deep strike, they have to do it normally. They can't use it to rapid ingress and do a bunch of other crap. So they got nerfed. And I think everybody kind of saw that coming. But the other side of that is that, yeah, they were just way too good, and GW needed to do something before their big, Worlds tournament. They were really afraid, guys, that Achillans were going to come into their Worlds tournament and just dominate everybody and just win the whole thing without really even trying too hard. So, yeah, Achillans are nerfed, but people still use Achillans, and Achillans are still great, especially against Eldar. If you can deep strike in the enemy's backfield, throw a grenade, shoot, that's really powerful. But, if you're deep striking into a squad of overwatching Dire Avengers or overwatching Wind Riders with Guide, you're not going to survive. And you're going to have to spend 2 CP immediately, put those bitches back in reserve, and then wait until the next turn to bring them in, and then you're going to do the same thing the next turn, just hose them down again, and that's it. Your opponent's not going to be able to attack your backfield if you use that strategy. So, I think there's a number of situations where a Farseer Skyrunner is better than a Farseer on foot. And that's why I put it also in S tier, because it's just like the Farseer. Yeah, it doesn't have the -1 to wound, but it has the ability to, maximize your Overwatch damage on several of your units. And I think that's worth putting in S tier. Next unit is Fire Dragons. We're going to put them in S tier as well. I love them. What can I say? They're great into Terminators. Deathwing Knights, I've never had trouble with Deathwing Knights with my Fire Dragons, right? I throw up 2 units of these guys against Deathwing Knights, and a squad of 5 evaporates. With Falcon support, of course. You're going to want one Falcon to, shoot in there, proc at least one of your units to have rerolls all wounds, and, you're just going to go to town on that unit. And usually, unless your opponent rolls like 8 4+s, which has happened to me. But, unless your opponent does that, you're going to take out that squad, especially throwing your grenade in there and stuff like that. So they have grenades, they have dragon fusion guns, which means they automatically kill a Deathwing Knight within 6 inches because it's melt to 3. And, if they fail their invulnerable save. And of course, they have decent overwatch as well. People don't think about it, but if you move a tank or something within 6 inches of these guys into the mid board, and you don't think about it, like I've had opponents move dreadnoughts within and say, okay, time for the fire dragons to get fried. I'm like, okay, I'm going to overwatch you and use a fate dice, turn it into a 6 with the Exarch, and then I'm going to roll my other 4 dice. Oh, look, there's another 6, and then just instead of the dreadnought going in and frying things, the dreadnought gets fried. So there are situations where that's, you know, a thing. It's definitely a thing in some situations. So fire dragons, I think, are just one of the better units in the index altogether. They're really good into the meta that exists now with heavy infantry. And they're even good against things like 8-bound, guys. I mean, my God, they can just go into a unit of 8-bound and wreck the whole thing. I've had situations where a squad of 5 just instant killed a unit of 3 8-bound and just called it a day right then and there. And 8-bound are expensive, you know? So, yeah, they're just an excellent unit. What can I say? They work really well with Falcons as well, but I'm convinced that they're also good on foot. And I've yet to try a unit of 10 on foot, but I'm going to try some units of 10 on foot soon, and I'll let you guys know how that goes. Okay, next up is the Fire Prism. Now, I had this in A tier before, but with the points changes, I'm going to put it in S tier. I'm actually surprised more people aren't using more Fire Prisms in their lists. I think they're really good. I guess the availability is a problem. I'm not a huge fan of Fire Prisms myself. Just my personal playstyle is more of an aspect warrior kind of thing. So I like Fire Dragons and Falcons. And I don't think you can really have a list with Fire Prisms and Falcons and Fire Dragons and still be effective just because you run out of deployment room. I think if you have Fire Prisms, you need something that can either scout up, like Wave Serpents with Corsairs in them, or you just need other types of units like Warwalkers or, just other stuff. Because in general, I don't think it's a good idea to, have the 3 Fire Prisms, then have a bunch of Falcons. You just have no deployment room in your deployment zone at that point. But I do think Fire Prisms are really good. They don't need Fate Dice to be effective. They have a free reroll to hit and reroll to wound built in, which is on top of the detachment bonus. So they're rerolling all their hits, they're rerolling all their wounds. They're really efficient. And because of excuse me, because of linked fire, you can basically, have 3 of these things always firing at any target that is down those firing lanes in Prinex's, train layouts. Especially with some practice, if you kind of, either on Tabletop Simulator or, at a board at home or at your local hobby store, kind of play around with line of sight and see what kind of angles you can get on any one turn with your Fire Prisms, you would be surprised that basically in every single terrain layout, there are big angles of line of sight that you can get with these 3. And yeah, Fire Prisms are really effective and really strong. And them being cheaper also really helps. All right, next up is Fuegan, my boy Fuegan. He's going to be S tier for obvious reasons. 1, he hits really hard in combat and at range. He has a mega fire pike that can basically one-shot things with a fate dice. So, target moves up, you deal 12 damage to it and say, see you later. And that's it. Anything with 12 wounds or less can get one-shotted. Alternatively, you can charge this guy into Terminators in close combat. He has Strength 5, a Damage 3 weapon. But, I mean, even against things like Chosen, Chosen are a very popular Chaos Space Marine unit. Fuegan rips them a new asshole, okay? And excuse my language on that, but really, I mean, he'll charge in there, and he'll basically kill an entire 5-man by himself. Without a doubt. hitting on 2s, wounding on 3s with a reroll built in, he's probably going to kill all 5. Or, I mean, at the very least, kill 4 of them, right? And that's on a bad roll. But he can also shoot before he goes in there. So if he wants to shoot his dispersed shot or his focus shot and just blast, a Chaos Space Marine out of the water before he goes in, he can also do that. So yeah, Fuegan, really good. And I think the best part about his kit is that he also has a free Phoenix gem built in where he could just revive on a 2+. So, I've had Fuegan kill many, many more than his points worth pretty much every game. He's a staple in a lot of my lists that include Fire Dragons and Falcons. He's not in every one of my lists because I kind of get bored of using him sometimes because he's just so strong. But in competitive play, he's absolutely one of the auto includes that people have in their lists. Okay, moving on to Guardian Defenders. Guardian Defenders, absolute A-tier unit. I think they're solid. They generate you fate dice. Now more than ever, Eldari need more fate dice to operate effectively. They do this for you. They allow your Avatar of Cain. They allow your support weapons. They allow your Fire Dragons and Falcons and Warwalkers and all those things to continuously put out efficient damage against your target enemies. And they help you screen the backfield, which is really important nowadays because of all the 3-inch deep strike and all the other BS that exists out there. Guardian Defenders can definitely help you out with that. And they're also pretty good themselves. They're only 100 points. They're fairly durable for the cost, and you get a Bright Lance included for free with the unit. And by the way, the Bright Lance is nothing to scoff at. It's still a Bright Lance, guys, right? So it's still pretty effective. So yeah, Guardian Defenders, A-tier unit. Nothing more to really say about them. Their ranged weapons are kind of whatever. Shuriken catapults aren't great. But in a pinch, they can take out a Marine or two. And again, soften up targets later on in the game for you to be able to secure objectives in the middle of the board. All right, next up is Hemlock Wraithfighter. And that's going to be our D-tier unit, our first D-tier. Now, I've kind of gone over this in a recent video, but yeah, I think the Hemlock is an absolute garbage unit. It not only can't use its ability when it comes into the board because of how many inches you have to be away from enemy models, but its weapons are garbage, and it's so swingy. It's D6 shots, and on top of being D6 shots, it hits on a 4+, this thing. So it's just awful. I mean, the weapons themselves would be good if they hit more accurately, and if they had a little bit more reliability. Like, instead of D6, maybe you have, something like 2D3, or shoot, let's just say 4, right? 4 shots apiece. I think it'd be much better than what it is now. It's just not good. It's just not good. And then when you come in, you do a little bit of damage, against some infantry targets or whatever it is, you're just going to get popped in return, and this thing is too expensive to really just include in your army for more than just fun. I personally hate this thing. I know that some people like it and like the look of the model. I love the look of the model. I think it deserves better than what it's got. But unfortunately, it's just not that good this edition. Hopefully, the codex changes that. All right, next up is the Hornet. Now, as we know, Imperial armor units are going to go the way of the Dodo very soon. But I have to say, the Hornet's still A-tier, right? It's still 100 points, which is fairly cheap. It has 2 Bright Lances that it can take. It's fast. It can do mortal wounds to units that it moves over. It's not a bad platform. It looks really cool as well. So it's basically a Warwalker without the Scout and without the invul save and stuff like that, but it exchanges it for more straight up damage against targets, being able to move over units and do mortal wounds. That's kind of its thing. It's also a little bit more durable against certain types of weapons because it has more wounds than the Warwalker. But in general, I just don't think the Hornet is as good as the Warwalker in competitive play, but it's still cool. I really like the Hornet, by the way. I think it's a really cool model. So unfortunately, it is going to be going the way of the Dodo with the codex, but for now, it's still an A-tier unit. Howling Banshees are next up. And yeah, I think they're A-tier, guys. I think they're really underrated. I think Howling Banshees being able to fight first at 70 points. By the way, they are the cheapest fights first unit that we have access to in the entire index. And I think that warrants talking about. So they're really good with heroic intervention. They're also just really good at charging enemy units across the entire battlefield. Like, they can really put your opponent on the defensive if you deploy them behind ruined walls at the edge of your deployment zone. your opponent is going to have to watch out for them and know that they can charge across the battlefield turn one and get a turn one charge on you. That's a really big psychological blow to a lot of opponents. Like, especially opponents that don't do well in melee, right? Like, Howling Banshees, you might think, yeah, they're only good against Marines, but they're actually good against a lot of stuff. Sisters of Battle are a unit, or excuse me, are an army that Sisters are really good against. Howling Banshees, sorry, are really good against because they can eliminate Battle Sister units super easily. They have a good number of attacks, right? I mean, in Sisters of Battle situations, the Mirror Swords are going to be better, but the Executioner is better against Space Marines in general. Even so, regardless, I mean, if you're able to threaten a Battle Sister squad from across the map and kill a majority of the squad before they can even strike back, and then force your opponent to be able to deal with those Howling Banshees before they move on into, the midboard or whatever, and you can block up movement like that, that's really powerful. Obviously, against some armies, Howling Banshees are not going to do well, like Orcs. Orcs, I think, are an army that they just don't do well against in general because, Orcs are toughness 5. Also, Leagues of Otan, they're not great against the Leagues of Otan because of that toughness 5. But anything toughness 4 or less, they do very well against for the points. And because of the fight's first ability, they can at least tie up enemy units. So that is pretty strong. Howling Banshees, definitely underrated and, I think warrant some use in several lists. Okay, Illic Nightspear is up next. I think Illic is probably B tier. Now, he's good because he gives his unit lone operative. He gives his ability, unit the ability to reroll wounds. Rangers, that is. But that's not really what you want to use Rangers for. You don't really want Rangers to be on top of a ruin shooting all game because that's not really what they're good at, right? They're going to be much better scoring objectives for you, move blocking. Those kind of things are going to be more necessary in your games than sitting back on a ruin and shooting. And that's a really expensive Ranger unit now, right? It's Illic, which is 70 points. And then on top of that, a unit of Rangers, which is 55 points. So you're paying 125 points for that unit when you could pay 85 points for a unit of Dark Reapers, and Dark Reapers can kind of do the same thing. Yeah, they're not lone op, but if they're on top of a 6-inch ruin or they're on top of a ruin, they can shoot down and, deal good damage to whatever they're shooting at. And they're cheaper, so they're more expendable. And to be honest with you, with Illic's squad, they're just not that good. They're very vulnerable to combat as well. The D6 movement, even with 2d6 with a Phantasm, sometimes isn't enough to get them out of trouble when they need to. So, I don't know. I just think Illic's not that great. I think he's also going to be replaced when the codex comes out. He's going to be just gone, way of the dodo, and you're probably not going to see him again, unfortunately. I like Illic. I like the idea of him, but he's just not really that strong. I think if you're going for more of a, kind of a Laytok styled list and you really want Illic in your, army and you have a bunch of Ranger stuff, I think he could be really cool in a list like that, especially when you combine him with Corsairs, right? Like, I think Illic's unit is actually better with Corsairs because of the fact that you could use their ability to jump back in the Wave Serpent when an enemy unit moves within 9 inches to get, because your opponent's going to have to get into range of lone op to be able to shoot them, and that is probably going to put them in range to, possibly proc their ability, and then the ability can just move them back into a Wave Serpent. So I think that's probably the best way to use them, and to kind of bait your opponent into stuff like that, and then have a decently strong unit that can come out, shoot some, precision shots at an enemy character and kill it the next turn. But I just don't think it's something you'll see a lot, and I think it's very niche and only works in a couple of different builds. Okay, next up is Irilith, the Shadow Spectre Phoenix Lord, and that's going to be C tier. Now, normally I'd put this in D tier, but I can't realistically put something that at least does damage in D tier because it at least does something, right? It at least does some damage. Its ability sucks, but it works, right? I mean, Shadow Specters are fast, so you can technically get a squad of Shadow Specters within range to use the ability. It's just not maybe required or not recommended for you to do so to get Shadow Specters that close to an enemy unit just to have -1 to battle shock tests. But yeah, I mean, that's basically it, right? That says it all in a nutshell. Irilith, Ability sucks. -1 to battle shock within 6 is terrible for a long range unit that doesn't want to be close to enemy units. And then on top of that, his ranged weapon really isn't that good. Has an awkward strength 8, AP -3, I believe, damage 4 profile, which is like really weird. It's only good against a certain amount of targets. And that's it. He doesn't have a dispersed profile at all. His melee profile is probably one of the worst out of all the Phoenix Lords. He hits on a 3 plus, by the way, base, so you can't even run him by himself and him be good. He's just not good, I think. And unfortunately, I hope they later bring this guy out in maybe an expansion or a kill team or something like that later on down the road, and they revamp him completely. But he is going to go away with the codex, so we're not going to see him for long, unfortunately. The next Phoenix Lord we want to talk about, of course, is Jane Czar. Jane Czar, also kind of an A tier Phoenix Lord. Now, the reason I say this is because Banshees are now pretty cost effective. Jane Czar is pretty cost effective. She gives her unit a free heroic intervention, which is much better now. And, she does really well against Space Marines, and she has good damage. I think the only thing about her is that she's point for point less efficient than Cahandras. And I think that's where really people, when they start to choose which melee units they want on their list, that's kind of what they go towards, because Cahandras is just way better than Jane Czar in general in combat. But then again, Jane Czar has more utility than Cahandras, so it's a toss-up. Personally, I think Cahandras is better, but Jane Czar also has a place, and I think if you're running her in a Falcon, that could be really effective as well. I think if you're running Jane Czar, you definitely want to run her in a Falcon with Howling Banshees, because their threat range is absolutely ridiculous. And after they kill their intended target, they could actually, in some cases, if you position them correctly, consolidate and then perhaps even heroically intervene, right? Now, consolidation, by the way, if you guys are wondering, well, you can't consolidate because you have to consolidate near an objective, or, towards the nearest objective, or towards the nearest enemy unit, and enemy units take priority. So it's not always going to be the case, but in some cases, you can actually position the unit to where you're actually moving back through a ruined wall to get closer to the objective, and you can actually kind of game it in a way where you end up being behind the wall. I know that sounds weird, and I wish I could show you on some of the terrain layouts what I'm talking about, but sometimes it is possible to consolidate back towards an objective and be on the other side of a ruined wall at the same time. So anyway, just thought I'd share that. Okay, next up is Cahandras, and he's definitely a S tier. He's just an absolute beast. He does a ton of damage, sustained hits on a 4-up when he charges in, gives his striking scorpions +1 to hit, has devastating wounds, has a ton of attacks, has great AP on his weapons. He's amazing. Pure and simple. Pure and simple. For 90 points, he's one of the most damaging and hard-hitting characters in the entire game. Especially when you throw reroll wounds on him from a Falcon, he becomes a monster. People do not like Cahandras. They fear Cahandras. I've seen Cahandras charge in to units of 8-bound with the rerolls and wipe out everything in the unit. Now, I'm not just talking about a unit of 3 guys. I'm talking about a unit of 6, and I'm talking about in competitive formats. He can just go in there and destroy. And I've rolled it myself, guys. I've not charged a squad of striking scorpions with Cahandras into a unit of 8 or 6 8-bound, but the math on it looks good. I mean, really, with the rerolls to wound, if you roll for, if you reroll for dev wounds, and you could do really well and just absolutely annihilate the squad. And I probably don't think you need to reroll for wounds with Cahandras himself, because he's wounding on 3+. So you probably don't want to reroll wounds with him. Like, all of them, that is, just the failed ones. But on the regular striking scorpions that he joins, absolutely you want to go for those rerolls, because the more devastating wounds you proc on those normal scorps, the more 8-bound are going to die. And 8-bound, they're tough. They're toughness 6, 3 wounds, 2-up save, 5-up invul, but they're not unbeatable. They're not unkillable. They do a ton of damage. They'll probably kill whatever they hit. But if you hit them first with something hard like Cahandras and striking scorpions and a Falcon, they'll die. And, very, very quickly. And also, the other funny thing about this is for much less points. Chondrus is 90 points, Scorpions are 65. So that's 155 points for the unit. Taking out a 280 point unit of 8 bound is crazy. Now, you do need the Falcon for help, but, the Falcon can always just fire and fade out of line of sight, or, sometimes your opponent won't even really have a charge against the Falcon unless they're, trying to zip Angron across the battlefield. And if they do that, then, possibly Angron's just going to die the next turn, right? If they're throwing Angron against a Falcon and you have something to kind of come out and then kill Angron in return, that's probably not the best move for the World Eaters player. So yeah, I just think whenever you can place a really cheap unit that can destroy a much more expensive unit, it's always going to be a good thing, obviously. So yeah, Chondrus S tier, no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. All right, next up is the Lynx. The Lynx I'm going to put in A tier. Now, the Lynx was much better when, you could pivot for free and everything like that, like when the pivot rules first came out in Prime Nexus, but they changed that. They fixed it. It was cheese. They needed to do it. And the Lynx now is just a little bit worse. It's still pretty good, but the problem with the Lynx that I see is that when you move it up the battlefield, it becomes vulnerable to shooting. Even though it's a little bit more durable than the fire prisms and stuff like that, because your opponent can draw line of sight to it, it's not durable enough to where it actually survives. So that's why it's A tier for me, but it does basically have 5 Bright Lance shots. Now, the Lynx Pulsar is more like a Pulse Laser than a Bright Lance, but it has a higher strength. So it's like a better Pulse Laser. And it has a d6 damage each, 5 shots, or 4 shots, I believe. Yeah, it's 4 shots. And then you get a Bright Lance on the weapon as well, on the Lynx as well. So yeah, it does good damage, but you're probably going to get popped right after it shoots something, unless you fire and fade. And again, it's kind of hard to maneuver around, so there's some battlefields where you maybe not be able to, actually move it as effectively as you think. All right, next is Moghan Raw. And Moghan Raw is C tier. Now, actually, looking at this model, you might think it would be B tier, but I actually think it's more along the lines of C tier nowadays because, again, like I said, it compares very bad to the Death Jester. I was talking about the Death Jester before in this video. It compares very badly to him. It doesn't really do anything for Dark Reapers except give them +1 to hit, which, again, doesn't do anything for the indirect fire weapon in the unit like it used to. So it's not great with that. And his ability is okay, but it's only against units that are below half strength. So, and it's only him. It's not the entire unit. If it was the entire unit, I would definitely place this guy higher up in the list. But since it doesn't affect the entire unit, it's only for himself. I just don't think it's a great ability. And that's unfortunate because Moghan Raw is a really cool character. He's a really cool Phoenix Lord. He has awesome lore. He has a new model that looks amazing. I wish he was better, but unfortunately he's just not. So, got to put him in C tier for now. Hopefully the codex changes that and makes him a little bit more usable. Oh, and the other thing is his weapon is decent, has devastating wounds, has ignores cover, but I mean it's just mediocre at best. It's basically a souped up shuriken cannon, and we have so many things that basically do the same stuff as him, right? He's just not that good for the points, right? Even for his damage. And his melee capabilities are pretty good, but he often doesn't get into melee. So, okay. Next up, we have the Night Spinner. Now, the Night Spinner, I'm also actually going to put in C tier. Now, I've tried to use the Night Spinner a couple times here and there in Prime Nexus, and it just doesn't really do what it used to because of the shorter deployment zones, because of the fact that it's 210 points, it takes a large chunk out of your army. It's often just not worth it. Now, I know that the Night Spinner can sometimes be good and can win you games in some cases because of its ability. -2 to movement, advanced rolls, and charges can absolutely win you the game later on against certain armies. But that's just the thing. It's only against certain armies, it's only in certain scenarios, and you kind of have to roll at least semi-decently for your wound rolls to be able to do any damage at all. And it's 210 points. Think about how much more could have impacted the game for 210 points, right? And then you can kind of, at that point you can kind of say, well, the Night Spinner, it did win me the game, but if I had 2 more units of this or 3 more units of that, could I have also had a similar effect? And the truth is, yes, you could have, right? Like against orcs, for example. This thing is great against armies that advance and charge. But if you have something that can either just kill something outright or can screen out those enemy units, it's still just not going to be as effective as the units that can screen and also kill those enemy targets. So, yeah, the Night Spinner is just too expensive. I think if it was 180 points again, it would be much better. It would be much more included occasionally in competitive lists. But 210 points, it doesn't feel good to run it, and it's so expensive for the utility and damage it provides. Okay, next up is the Nightwing. The Nightwing is a forge-rolled flyer, and it is D tier. I would actually argue that it's worse than the Crimson Hunter, or excuse me, than the Hemlock. And the reason being is because it just has no weapons. It has a twin-linked shuriken cannon, and it has a twin-linked bright lance, and that's it. The weapons are low. The damage is low. It doesn't get +1 to wound against flyers. It only gets +1 to hit. And it's kind of expensive. I think it's about the same cost as a Crimson Hunter. I think it's actually might be the same cost as a Hemlock Wraithfighter. So at the same points cost, you would expect that this thing has more weapons, but it doesn't. And then the funniest thing is in this Forge World, this is out of the Imperial Armor Mimera book, right? You see one of the Night Spinner or Night Wings taking a hit and going down in the background. So that should show you how terrible these things are. They're really bad. Really terrible. Cool model, though. And I think if you have one, just proxy it for a Crimson Hunter and call it a day. I think that's basically the best move you can do there. So yeah, not a good flyer. Next we have I believe this is the Phantom Titan. Now the Phantom Titan we can't really kind of judge in a regular game of 40k, but I think it's pretty good. Hopefully I'm going to be doing a review later on in the edition with my buddy Corey Collects from Corey Collects. It's a YouTube channel, by the way, guys. And he does painting and stuff like that. He bought one of these armor cast Phantom Titans, and he's hopefully going to be painting it up eventually. We'll talk about it then. But I would say this thing is probably C tier. Like if you're playing a 3,000 point game, just because it's 2,100 points, it's going to be a vast majority of your list. If you run the support with it, you're really not going to be able to do much else besides just have this thing kill stuff. So competitively speaking, and even if you want to just win your game, I don't think it's great, but it's super fun, right? I mean, that's why it's in C tier. It's a super fun model. It does a bunch of damage. It kills a lot of stuff. It's just not going to win the game for you. It's not going to score objectives for you, really, because if you put it out in the open, it's just going to die. It's not tough enough to where it can actually survive a full 2 turns of shooting from an enemy army. I think it has like 55 wounds, which is really, really good, guys. But, that's the thing. Is it going to be able to actually survive the entire game on the middle of the battlefield? No, it's not. And your opponent can just simply play around it because its base size is so big, it really can't move that well. So even if you're throwing Fortune and Guide and stuff like that on it, if your opponent just plays around it, plays the missions, and ignores it, then you're just going to lose every game. So honestly, competitively speaking, I don't like it, but it is cool and it does a ton of damage. So, that's never to be underestimated. All right, next is Rangers. Rangers are A tier. Love Rangers. The only reason I don't put them in S tier is because I think that in some matchups they kind of suck and you're probably going to want Striking Scorpions instead. But in a lot of matchups, especially against melee-oriented armies or armies that, kind of don't fly, these guys are great because they can move up, they can infiltrate, move block, and if you get the first turn, they can just spread out and move block your entire opponent's army in some cases and also score an objective at the same time. I've had these guys literally score an objective and block the enemy from getting where they wanted to go turn 1 at the same exact time. And they're cheap. They're only 55 points. They're really kind of surprisingly durable against stuff like bolters. Like if your opponent wants to shoot some bolters at them, they're -1 to hit. They have cover usually with a 5+, so they'll usually have like a 4+ save against it. And sometimes, if your opponent has a higher AP value, they're just going to get their invul save a 5+ against their shooting. So they can survive reasonably well. And, excuse me, the, sorry, man, I've been sick this last, kind of 2 weeks, and there's just this lingering cough. But anyway, they can kind of survive sometimes long enough and unexpectedly enough to score on things like sabotage. Like, I've had my opponent legitimately shoot bolters at this unit, thinking that, bolters shooting 2 shots apiece would be able to wipe this squad out. And then it doesn't. And my opponent's just sitting there with his, just this like dumbfounded look, like, how did they survive, my attacks? It's like, well, because you didn't take them seriously, right? If you don't take these guys seriously, they will survive with like 1 or 2 models left. They will finish scoring that objective, and they will score you some good secondary points. So, yeah, Rangers are really good. I always run at least 1 unit of these guys if I can in my army, because they're just so useful and so good with scoring and move blocking. Okay, next up we have the Phantom Titan, or Revenant Titan, I should say. I'm going to kind of put it in the same category, C tier. You can run this in normal games. But it's a little less durable than the Phantom Titan. It does a little less damage than the Phantom Titan, but it's smaller. It has an ability that I think it can advance and shoot. I think it can advance 9 inches and still shoot with its weapons. Something along those lines. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what it is. So, do I think this is the best model out there? Absolutely not. Do I think it's complete garbage, unusable? Well, it's 1,100 points, so you can technically run this and run 900 points worth of other stuff. And I think it's fun. I think in a casual game, you could even win the game because of this thing, with the right buffs and stuff like that. I just don't think it's competitive, and it's definitely more in the C tier realm. And again, the only reason I'm not putting it in D tier is because it actually does do a lot of damage, and it does a lot of work. Okay, next up is the Scorpion. Now, the Scorpion is definitely going to be a B tier unit. I mentioned this before. It's basically the better version of the Cobra. It has better range. It has a better weapon. Its ability allows it to proc Devastating Demise or Deadly Demise on a 4+ on enemy units that have that special rule, so tanks and stuff like that, which is amazing. Think about it, Enemy Land Raider in the middle of the battlefield. Boom. Blows up, procs Deadly Demise within 6 inches, D6 mortal wounds to everything around it. That can be really powerful. That could be really good, guys. And I think, realistically, against a lot of armies, like even Imperial Guard, where they have a lot of units bunched up in these firing lanes because their armies are so big, this thing blows up a Leman Russ battle tank, and all of a sudden, everything within 6 inches is suffering D6 Deadly Demise wounds. That's awesome. That could be really, really powerful. So, yeah, I think still B tier because it's still a little bit hard to maneuver. I think it takes a good player that knows how to use the unit well to have it be successful and, kind of know the ins and outs of the unit. But I think it can be definitely used in competitive play. I think it's probably one of the only super heavy units that is viable for competitive play, especially if you really like using it and you know how to use it. And by the way, I'm also going to have a little bit of a small interview with somebody that is going to be at Worlds that is using the Scorpion. So we can talk about that a little bit. Pretty awesome model. Okay, next up is the Shadowseer. Now, you guys already know what I think of the Shadowseer. Definitely D tier. Why D tier? Well, there's a ton of anti-synergy that it has, and it actually makes your Harlequins worse, in my opinion, than if you run them just normally. Couple reasons for this. One, stealth does nothing when you're in a transport. Harlequins typically want to be in a transport, a Star Weaver or something like that, so they can unlock all their little tricks and so forth. And the Shadowseer not being able to use its advance and charge out of a transport makes it terrible just because of that. Second, stealth does nothing, like I said. Third, you can't advance and throw a grenade anymore, so that sucks, and grenades are a big part of Harlequins. So, yeah, its damage isn't good. A Troop Master does better damage, arguably, much better damage with its ability, greater AP, and so forth. So, overall, I just really don't like this thing. I think it sucks, unfortunately. in situations where it would be good, where you can get a turn one charge off on it, like Howling Banshees, you're paying almost double the points for a Howling Banshee unit, and you're not doing that much more damage than a Howling Banshee unit would do against the same target. So, yeah, enough said. It's trash. If you guys want more details on why it's trash, I just made a video about it, about the worst units in the Aeldari Index, and I think, unfortunately, Shadow Seer is one of them. Okay, next up is Shadow Specters. Now, Shadow Specters are definitely still good, and I would say they're still A tier. They're not used as much because they're really expensive, but move, shoot, move is a very powerful ability. Being able to deal damage 3 is also really good. It's something our army doesn't really have. So, that's also a really good point to the Shadow Specters. They're fairly durable with a 3+ armor save and stealth. So they have decent durability as well on top of it. And that's about it. They can also clear out light infantry really well. They're just a really versatile unit that's good into a lot of different targets. They're fairly durable, and they're also very mobile. So even at 115 points, which I think is too expensive, they're still pretty good at that price point. Next up is Shining Spears. Now, Shining Spears, some of you guys may disagree with me, but I don't care. A tier. And here's my reasoning behind this. They are more situational. And really I just like the unit because even if it's not good in every single situation, like a lot of people will look at Shining Spears and they'll say things like, "Oh, well they don't do enough damage into Marines," or, "They're really hard to charge through walls," and stuff like that. And that is true, but if you position them correctly, charging through walls isn't a problem. And I wish I could explain this better. I explained it a little bit in my Shining Spears video that I made a couple days back. But basically what it is in a lot of Pariah Nexus terrain setups, you have the walls in such a way where there's an L shape on one side and then there's nothing on the other. It's just, the top part of the quote unquote L. And on those sides, you can just easily wrap around the ruin if you position your Shining Spears correctly in the previous turn, and still make an easy charge against a unit on the other side of it, regardless of whether or not they're positioned to be able to stop you from charging through the ruin wall, which can get them into combat. Now, the other thing that the Shining Spears are really good at, I think, is being a flex unit. And what I mean by a flex unit is, yes, they're good against Space Marines, they're good at dealing damage against Space Marines in close combat, whatever, right? That's their damage speciality. But they can also do a lot of other cool stuff. They can also easily score on things like sabotage, right? And many people might not think of them as a unit that can do this, but they're just durable enough to where your opponent's going to have to commit significant resources to killing them if they're in a terrain piece behind a ruin wall that that they can just hide behind and score that objective on. They're not like a unit of Rangers where your opponent can just, maneuver some flamers into position and just flame the target out, right? Just destroy them with a unit of flamers, or destroy them with, some sort of indirect fire, or just charge into them with some assault intercessors, right? Shining Spears will survive against all of the previous units I just mentioned. Squad of 5 assault intercessors or jump assault intercessors tries to assault some Shining Spears behind a ruin wall. First of all, they're going to have trouble getting in because the Shining Spears bases are so big, they cover a lot of distance. But even if they are able to get around, maybe only one of them makes base contact to get those mortal wounds, and then they have to attack normally. And these guys are -1 to hit. They're toughness 4. They're 2 wounds apiece. They're 3+ save, 4+ invul. Right? Or, yeah, because well, I guess on that turn they wouldn't have a 4+, they would have a 5+ invul. But even so, you're not going to need it because, assault intercessors, they don't really have anything that's, more than AP2 except for the power fist on the leader. And even then, you can take saves and, possibly with the Exarch, who does have a 4+ invul save. And then you strike back and probably kill a lot of the models that charged in. So, or at the very least, right, survive and score the objective. So I don't know. I just think they can do a lot more than people give them credit for. They're only 90 points now. It's not like you're paying a bunch of points for them like in the past. They're not as good at scoring secondaries as things like Rangers Shroud Runners, Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, but they're durable enough to score certain secondaries well, and they can do a lot more. They can do a lot more other things that shooting units like Shroud Runners, Rangers, stuff like that can't do, because those units cannot engage in combat and do anything significant, while the Shining Spears can. So I actually do think Shining Spears are a little bit better now than people give them credit for, and I believe they're actually going to make an appearance in some of the Eldari lists that are being brought to Worlds. Don't quote me, but I've heard it in the grapevine that some people are bringing Shining Spears. So, there you go. If you needed some proof from the competitive community that Shining Spears are not as bad as you say they are, there you go. Don't take my word for it. All right, so that's Shining Spears. Shroud Runners, I gotta say, are S tier. Now, I think Shroud Runners are just one of those units that works really well with a vast majority of Eldar units. They're really good at move blocking. They're hard to hit. They're hard to pin down. They have that durability that Shining Spears have that I was talking about earlier. They still have the large bases. They just are not as maybe flexible as the Shining Spears, being able to hit heavy infantry and kill them. But I think they do such a good job at their own role that they definitely are in S tier. I think they're basically, and again, they're not a unit that appears in every GT list, but in every GT list I've seen them in, they've done pretty well for themselves, and they can handle themselves quite effectively. And I've used them a lot personally, and what I can say from personal experience is that the Shroud Runners are amazing. They're great into a number of matchups, and I've never found a game where I was looking at my Shroud Runners and thinking that I should have had something else, or regretting taking them in the game. They're really good, and I think everybody should consider taking one unit in their list. They also have a lot of synergy with things like Wind Riders, which I also really like. And, again, Wind Riders, Shroud Runners, they pretty much go hand in hand. Okay, so next up we have the Skothak Wraith Knight. Now, the Skothak Wraith Knight, I think, is still a great model, and I'm a little convinced that it's actually an A tier unit still. And I know a lot of you guys will probably disagree with it, but it has appeared in competitive play. I think the ability to remove it from the battlefield and deep strike it wherever you want to, bringing it back from reserve, just like you would a squad of Swooping Hawks once per game. The fact that it has essentially a dual Inferno cannon setup where it can, get the Melta bonus within 12 inches is really strong. And yeah, it doesn't have the -1 damage of the regular Wraith Knight, but I still think it's extremely good. And, having mobility on such a great and powerful monster is really powerful. Is really good. So, yeah, I think it's A tier. I've used it myself in a couple of games. It's never failed to disappoint. It kills whatever it hits usually, and whether that be Terminators or a big tank or something like that, it just does amazing. I've thrown Guide on this thing. I've thrown, Fortune on it, and it typically survives better than you think as well. So, yeah, I think it's really good. Now, its competition, the Wraith Knight, the normal Wraith Knight, they're played differently, I think. I think this is a more mobile, more aggressive version of the Wraith Knight. Its weapons are a little bit different, but it's cheap enough to where it could also just be normally placed in reserve, just in case you don't want to, have it on the battlefield, taking up space in the early game. So that is also a thing. Its weakness probably is that its melee capabilities are not good, right? It just gets the Titanic feet, which aren't a great melee attack, but because it can just fall back and shoot and do the normal stuff with the, stratagem, feigned retreat, it's usually not a big deal. So yeah, I actually think the Skothak Wraith Knight is still an A tier unit, but probably on the lower end of A tier. I think it does require a really specific kind of list to work well, and I think it does require a lot of synergies that, are probably, kind of constrict its use to certain types of lists. All right, next up we have the Skyrunners. Now the Skyrunners, or Skyweavers, sorry, not Skyrunners. The Skyweavers are going to be A tier. Now, I think their latest points increases kind of probably bumped them out of S tier, to be honest. I think they're still good, but I think their Haywire is not good against certain factions. Against Chaos Demons, it's pretty much worthless. There's a few other, matchups like Nids, which it's not good against. It's not really great against Hypercrypt Necrons. There's a lot of lists that Haywire is just not going to be effective into. But, against a vast majority of the armies out there, Haywire is going to be good. Now, the other thing about Haywire, it's a 4 plus. So you either do a bunch of damage or you do nothing, which, it's kind of a trade-off, right? You have the potential to do a ton of automatic damage, but at the same time, because it hits on a 4 plus, sometimes you can whiff. So you do have to watch out for that a little bit as well. They are also a decent melee threat with the Zephyr Glaives, or you can give them the Star Bolas. I think both are pretty good options for these guys. I prefer the Star Bolas a little bit because my lists typically already have melee options that I can utilize, so I don't need another unit that can, clean up something in melee combat. But both options are good, having said that. So yeah, I think these guys are still great, still A tier. You'll still see them in competitive lists. But my problem with them is primarily that, they're very swingy and they might actually at their price point not do a whole lot for you in certain matchups. All right, then we have the Solitaire. So the Solitaire is absolutely an S tier model, especially since the changes to Heroic Intervention. I can't stress enough how good it is to have something that can heroically intervene with fights first and the absolute amount of damage that this guy has. 9 attacks, hitting at strength 6, hitting on 2 plus, AP minus 2, damage 2, will wreck a lot of Space Marine units. Your entire army, well, at least, units within 6 of this guy are pretty safe from assault intercessors, heavy assault intercessors, jump pack assault, whatever, right? Any kind of Space Marine assault unit is going to be hard pressed to be able to beat you after the Solitaire attacks, especially with a reroll to hit and reroll to wound. This guy is amazing. He's also a lone op, so he can score objectives fairly easily. He can hide easily because he has a 25mm base. So that's really cool. He can blitz across the battlefield once per game, get 3 attacks, and get a bunch of extra movement. I've used this guy to hit enemy units turn 1 and just absolutely obliterate them. I mean, so I don't know if you guys know this. I recently, about a month or so back, had a game against Thousand Suns in which on turn 2, I basically charged this guy up into a unit of Rubric Marines, not only killed all the Rubrics in the squad with a blitz, but also killed the Exalted Sorcerer leading them. And yeah, he died afterward, but he made up double his points cost, basically. And there was nothing my opponent could do about it. It was just absolutely incredible. This guy is really a hard-hitting beast. And here's the other thing. If you draw Assassinate on any turn, this guy's basically a guaranteed point for Assassination because he can kill almost any character in the game, aside from some of the Primarchs and stuff like that. So if you're going after a captain or, an Orc war boss or something like that, just, your standard leader models that are going to be leading units to buff their damage or whatever. This guy can easily take those models out, no problem. So yeah, I think Solitaire, definitely an S tier pick. And requires a little bit of finesse, I'm not going to lie. Requires a little bit of positional, awareness, but can be really good when used correctly. Okay, next up we have the Spirit Seer. So the Spirit Seer is going to be an A tier unit. Now, I would have actually put this guy a little bit lower, but the reason I've moved him up to A tier is because we're seeing a resurgence of Wraith units, and I think this guy works really well with Wraith Guard and Wraith Blades. You basically need to have him in those squads. So I would actually put him in A tier. Giving a unit of Wraiths +1 to hit, lethal hits, and the ability to revive a model per round makes Wraiths really effective, especially in units of 10. So, even though he's kind of fragile, you have to protect him. You have to keep him behind a ruined wall typically so that, he doesn't have line of sight to enemy snipers and stuff like that. But, if you can keep alive, he's one of the best assets that a Wraith unit can have. All right, next up is the Starweaver. Starweaver's also A tier, guys. Not a surprise. It's one of the best transports that we have. In my opinion, it's better than a Venom just because Shuriken Cannons are a little bit more versatile than Venom Cannons are, in my personal opinion. except probably in Yunari, but that's about it. And yeah, I think this thing's great, right? It allows Harlequin units to jump back into it after combat, has a 4+ invulnerable save, 2 shuriken cannons, it's only 80 points. It's really effective. And I think especially with the changes to tank shock, it's now slightly better than it was at dealing mortal wounds alongside your Harlequin units, right? This thing can charge in with you, deal additional mortal wounds to your target with a tank shock, and then you can, of course, hop your Harlequins back in once you destroy that enemy unit. So there's just a lot of really cool, interesting things you can do with this thing. You know, you can place it behind a ruin wall. Your Harlequins can charge on the other side of the ruin wall and then hop back into it from that other side. It's just, the possibilities are endless with this thing, and I just really love it with Harlequins. Next up is Storm Guardians. And guys, I think you guys know where I'm going to place Storm Guardians. No, I'm just kidding. It's not S tier. They're definitely A tier. So we're going to put them down in A tier. Now, why aren't they S tier? Well, because I don't think certain builds actually need Storm Guardians. Like, they're not a requirement for every build out there. And they're not even in most builds. It's just, they're really good for the cost. They're only 100 points. You get a really good package deal with them. You know, especially when you can attach the Farseer, or excuse me, I keep saying Farseer, but Autarch on foot with them, the Footarch, they become exceptionally good. And even if you don't have the Footarch, they're a pretty expendable unit. They can screen for you. They can give you good overwatch. They can duel pretty effectively with other, you know, kind of Space Marine type units if they can get the jump on them. And in general, just a really strong unit for the points. And, you know, they're fairly durable as well. Okay. Oh, and of course, I should mention, they have sticky objectives, which make them really good at being able to kind of lock down certain spots in the battlefield. Next up is Striking Scorpions, and they're going to go in S tier. Now, they're an S tier unit, obviously, because they're really cheap. They do a lot of damage for the cost. They outtrade almost any other unit in their weight class as far as, you know, basic infantry. And when you put them with Kahandras, they all of a sudden become world killers. I mean, literally being able to just chew through enemy units with rerolls to wound. Really good unit. They have infiltrate. They can screen for you if you need to. They can get good alpha strikes. And by the way, I think Eldar are one of those factions that in some builds can really benefit from going first. Just because you have things like striking scorpions, war walkers, things that can really kind of get the jump on enemy units, kill them before they can react. So yeah, striking scorpions, really good for the cost. A really good unit. I recently bought several of them myself, and I'm going to be painting them up shortly, and maybe I'll post some pictures of them on YouTube once I'm done. Well, once I'm done with them, obviously. Okay, next up is support weapons. And support weapons are going to be A tier. They're good. Don't get me wrong, but they are fragile and they're expensive. So they really require a certain build type to be able to be used. And I'm almost wanting to put them in B tier, but I realize that in some builds, in those builds where they're good in, they're really good in them. And they can do a lot of damage for you. And I think that makes them at least worth, you know, considering in certain army lists. And again, indirect fire is super powerful. So, you know, you have something that can indirect fire into enemy units that can pretty much destroy things in one shot. It can one-shot things like rhinos, dreadnoughts. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be at least an S tier, even if it was 140 points. I think you would still see people taking this thing. And as of now, you know, 135 points does seem a little bit pricey for them, and I think it is, personally. But it's still effective. If you can protect them, if you can make sure that they're alive all game, they will provide a ton of value for you. And that's without a doubt. So, got to still put them in A tier, even though they're not my personal cup of tea at this personal moment. Just because, you know, I'm loving Falcons, I'm loving Aspect Warriors. And so, you know, support weapons have kind of not found their place in those lists. But I've run them before earlier in the edition, and I loved them then. And I still think they're, you know, pretty much almost as good now. Okay. Swooping Hawks. Swooping Hawks are still S tier, no doubt about it. Being able to sky leap, score objectives, being able to take out, trash chaff units that are on the backfield objectives is really good, even at 85 points. I think they're a steal. And I have to say, I think that there's obviously units that are better than Swooping Hawks now, as far as being able to, go into reserve and come out, and go into reserve and come out. Things like Vespid are only 65 points, so arguably Vespid do a better job at the objective side of things. But Vespid can't really deal with chaff units as well as Swooping Hawks. And if you look at, kind of the, buffs and stuff like that Swooping Hawks can potentially get, if you really need to on certain turns, you can do a lot of damage with them. So, realistically, are they as good at, scoring secondaries as Vespid? No, for the points, but they're better damage than Vespid. And they also do better damage than Mandrakes, things like that. And recently we did see Mandrakes get also increased in points. So, they're 15 points more than Mandrakes, but they do more range damage. They do it from a safer distance. And oftentimes they can, pump out more damage against things that are in the enemy backfield, like cultists, small units of Imperial Guardsmen, and so forth. Okay, looking at our next unit is the troop. The troop is A tier as well. Now, I think it's A tier by itself. I think it becomes S tier when you join it with a troop master, or with Yvrain, or with any of those other combinations. But by itself, it's A tier. It's a decent melee unit for the cost. We have 2 fusion pistols, 2 neural pistols, and a unit of 5. We have the grenades ability. So these guys can actually do quite a bit on their own for 75 points, but they really start to unlock once you start to put the characters in them. So, having said that, they do have +1 to wound on the charge, which does also benefit their characters. So if we look at the Troop Master is, I think, also an A tier unit with these guys. And I think when they're together, they actually become an A tier, especially when you combine them with things like the Falcon. They start to do some really serious work. So the Troop Master gives them devastating wounds. The Troop Master has pretty good damage himself, can take a fusion pistol and stuff like that, but also has the ability to change a fate dice to a 6 for himself. So you could change a fusion pistol damage to a 3. You could pop a Terminator with him potentially. You can make sure that, he's dealing a lot of damage in combat. You can auto devastating wound one of his attacks. So yeah, this guy's really good. And in combination, I think the Troop and the Troop Master are excellent, especially when you have them out of a Falcon. But they're also really good out of a Star Weaver. It just depends what you want to go for and what types of enemy units you want to hit. I think if you want to hit lighter units that are not as durable, the Star Weaver is your boy. I think if you want to go against units that are more durable, things like Terminators, heavy armor, heavy invul save, then you're going to want to go with the Falcon for those rerolls to wound. Okay. Next up is the Vizark, and I actually think the Vizark is easily an A tier unit, without a doubt. He has extremely good damage himself that is also precision. He can take out enemy characters fairly effectively. He also benefits from the +1 to wound that the Harlequins give him when he joins a unit of Quins, which he should join. He should be joined to Quinn units usually, so that makes him hit even harder. He can choose between lethal hits, devastating wounds, and sustained hits too every single turn. You're probably going to want to go with sustained hits too most of the time, but against really tough targets, maybe lethal or, even devastating wounds can be good as well. Especially devastating wounds when you're re-rolling wounds with a Falcon. So if he's in a Falcon, devastating wounds all of a sudden seems like the better option. But if he's just, in a squad of 10 Quins, then you're probably just better off with the, regular old sustained hits. All right, next is the Void Weaver, and I think the Void Weaver is probably B tier. I know some people argue otherwise, but I just think that, for the points, it is cheaper now. It is 115, but for the points, it just doesn't seem quite as good as a Warwalker. I know that it has 2 Shuriken Cannons as well, but the Shuriken Cannons just don't seem to do as much damage against its intended targets. Right? I mean, really, this thing wants to be hunting large targets and, other kind of maybe even light vehicles. And I think that the Shuriken Cannons just aren't as good into those targets, but still pretty decent. It does pass out a Battle Shock test, but again, Battle Shock isn't the greatest thing in the world. I think this thing can be good, but I've never truly been that impressed with it when I've used it. So, you know, again, it's decent. I think it was a lot better at 100 points in the beginning of the edition when it was cheaper. But nowadays, it's just okay, and I just think it's good in some builds, perhaps, but not the best choice in every build. Okay, next up we have the Viper. So the Viper is going to be A tier as well. Viper's cheaper now at 75 points. It can take a Bright Lance. It can remove cover from an enemy unit that it shoots at with its Shuriken Catapult or Bright Lance, perhaps. So that's also really good for making sure that your Falcons, your Fire Prisms, all those units are guaranteeing kills into enemy units. This is especially good, guys, into Sisters of Battle. I know it may not seem like it, but the Viper is actually a low-key awesome model into Sisters. Reason why is because Sisters have those dreaded miracle dice, guys. They have the same thing as us, but they have 4 times as many. So that means that if you shoot a Fire Prism at a, Sisters of Battle Exorcist or a Sisters of Battle, vehicle. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but they have like this Predator equivalent vehicle that is pretty tough. They can actually just use Miracle Dice to just automatically save your wounds if they're in cover. So being able to remove cover, being able to basically make it so that the Sisters of Battle cannot make a save against your Fire Prisms is really strong. And I think each and every time, if you're, in a sister heavy meta, I think you should consider using the Viper for removing cover against vehicles so that they're not going to be able to get saves against your Melta-Guns, your fusion guns from your Fire Dragons, and your, basically Fire Prisms. And even sometimes Warwalkers and other Bright Lances, because they'll need 6s instead of just 5s to be able to save against those targets if they're in cover. Okay. Next up is the single Warlock, and I would say the single Warlock probably C tier, just because it's a little too expensive. It's 45 points. Really, it has good abilities, guys. It does. It has good abilities, but the problem is it's too expensive for what it does. An auto 6-inch advance is not worth 45 points. A -2 to charge rolls is not worth 45 points. Its damage is not worth 45 points. Its durability is not worth 45 points. It's just not a 45-point model. It's a 30-point model trapped in a 45-point model body. I think if it was 30 points, it'd be much better, and I think it'd be very viable. It'd be an A tier if it was only 30. But at 45, it's just a little bit too expensive. It doesn't really do a lot. It actually makes it so it's harder to trade with other units of equal cost. And in general, I just don't think it's a great model altogether. But, it's not terrible. I think if, in some cases, especially if you're, kind of, maybe you have 45 points left and you have absolutely nothing to spend it on, maybe you buy a Warlock for 45 points. Maybe that's the play, right? You just throw a Warlock into the list just because you don't have any other points. But that's really the only place I see it in, to be honest. Warlock Conclaves on foot, I'm also going to put in C tier, but they're obviously worse than the Warlocks here, just the single Warlocks, because they're just really expensive. They don't do a ton of damage for the points. To make them worth it, you really need to put them in a Falcon as well, and it just becomes a huge point sink into a unit that's not really that good. I ran a list like this that was pure Psychers early on in the edition, and even with all the extra Fate dice we had and stuff like that at the time, they just didn't seem that effective. I have to be honest. They hit Marine units pretty hard, like your basic Marines and stuff like that. They just wiped off the board, but there were more points in the Marines by a significant amount. A Farseer and these guys were 200 points, plus the Falcon was 340 points. And, they wiped out a unit of 5 pretty easily, but then they just, got shot up in return. And yeah, they are more durable than normal Eldar, but your opponent can still wipe out a significant amount per turn. And I think the only thing that made these guys really effective anyway was the Falcon. And the Falcon carried a lot of those games for me. So yeah, I just think unless these guys get a detachment bonus when the codex comes out, they're just not going to be that great altogether. Okay, next up is the single Warlock Skyrunner, and I think he's an A tier just because Wind Riders are so good. He allows them to ignore cover. he could possibly give them -1 to hit or stealth as well, which is a really powerful ability on them, especially if they're taking fire. So yeah, I have to say it's a really good model. It is a little bit expensive. I think realistically this guy should be about 45 points and not 55, but he's still effective enough. Being able to remove cover from something is really good. Giving your whole unit ignores cover is amazing, right? Especially your Farseer Skyrunner. If he's in the same unit, getting ignores cover with AP -2 Eldritch Storm, ooh, guys, that's spicy. Trust me, this unit, Windriders, Farseer Skyrunner, Warlock Skyrunner, hits so hard. I've killed Terminator units with this. I've killed vehicle units with this, with lethal hits from Shroudrunners. There's not a lot in the game that this unit won't do significant damage against. So it's one of my personal favorites. I've painted up. It's. By the way, guys, you know me as somebody who proxies a lot of stuff. You know, obviously, right? Proxy hammer. This is a unit that I've actually painted up, and actually put the time into creating, making a real unit of them because they're so awesome. So yeah, absolutely great. I think it's A tier. You could argue that by itself it's overpriced, but when you combine it with all the other things that make it good, it's definitely worth it. Okay, then we have the Skyrunner Conclave, and that is, again, I'm going to put it in C tier. It's just too expensive. It would be good if it wasn't as expensive as it was, but, they're like 40 points a piece or something ridiculous like that, or, yeah, I think, 40 points per model, which is stupid, which is absolutely ridiculous. So, yeah, just way too expensive for what they do. Yeah, they have an inbuilt fortune, but that's not really worth it when you consider the cost. And their feel no pain against psychic attacks really just doesn't make sense either. They should just have feel no pain regardless then, right? It shouldn't just be against psychic attacks. So yeah, I don't know. I just think these guys are pretty lame in general, and I hope that with the codex they become a lot better. And again, the only reason they're not in D tier is because they're just too expensive. I think if they were cheaper, they'd be fine. All right, next up is the Warp Hunter. The Warp Hunter is a Legends unit, or Forge World unit, I should say, not Legends, it's Feral Armor. And that's going to be in D tier. Now, I didn't include this in my last video because I didn't include any Legends units, or not Legends, sorry, Forge World units. But yeah, this is a terrible model. Its weapon is really low range. It has really low damage. It's 130 points, but right now that's the same as the Falcon. The Falcon is miles better than this thing. It just really isn't good. If you guys want to know the specific rules to it, you can look it up in the Imperial Armor. This is called the Warp Hunter, but essentially it has kind of a D-cannon on it, but the D-cannon isn't as good as the normal D-cannon, if that makes sense. It has like a fixed damage, so you can't even use Fate Dice on it to like boost its damage rolls. It just sucks. It's not good. It's a waste of points in my opinion, and even though it looks cool, it's absolute garbage. Warp Spiders are S tier. We don't even have to really talk about that much. They're really good, right? They do solid damage against a number of targets with devastating wounds and torrent. They're really fast. They can score objectives easily. They can screen for you really effectively because they just move 24. It's not like Swooping Hawks that have to deep strike outside of 9 inches. So Warp Spiders can spread out, screen, and at the same time do some damage. They're a great unit. What can you say? They are expensive at 125. So that is a consideration. A lot of people running triple spider often don't have room for a lot of, heavier hitters in their list. Warp spiders do not hit incredibly hard. What they do is they hit incredibly reliably. So they will reliably do about 3 mortal wounds for you on top of whatever else you can get through against your, intended target. But they don't do a ton of damage because they're just strength 4 weapons with dev wounds, right? They have d6 attacks apiece, so you'll get 66 attacks, 3.5 each. You'll get about, 18, and you'll get about 18 attacks, and about 3 of them will be dev wounds on average. That's about what you can expect. So Warp Spiders, they do have good damage, but it's only good damage against certain targets. And I think that's what people sometimes miss is that, yeah, it's, they have devastating wounds, but they can't just kill anything in the game, right? Even 15 warp spiders will only on average do about 9 mortal wounds to a target, so you could definitely take something out, but you're also spending 375 points to do it. So whatever you take out, you better make sure that it's at least 375 points, right? Because these warp spiders, unfortunately, are very, very fragile. So you do have to watch out for that, right? But as a utility unit, like I always at least try to take 1 unit of warp spiders in my lists. Like sometimes the lists I bring don't have warp spiders because I just can't fit them. But if I can fit them, I often do because they are good, right? They are a good utility unit. They do have a number of great applications, and they are one of the most powerful aspect warriors in our index. Okay, next up, we have the Wave Serpent. Now, I actually think the Wave Serpent's cheap enough now to be considered A tier. Probably a lower A tier unit, but A tier nonetheless. 110 points puts it at the same price point as a Warwalker, which, if you compare the durability of the two units, the Wave Serpent has comparable durability against several weapon types. So that is true, right? Warwalker has a 4+ invul, Wave Serpent has a 5. Wave Serpent has 13 wounds, Warwalker has 6. So, less of an invul, but more wounds. Warwalker has -1 to wound, but again, a Wave Serpent also has, more wounds and a greater toughness in general. Toughness 9 versus toughness 7. So against some weapon types, the Wave Serpent will actually be just as durable, if not more durable, against the wound roll. And as far as its weapons go, it has a shuriken cannon and twin linked bright lance versus the Warwalker's 2 bright lances. And again, I think the Warwalker's definitely better than the Wave Serpent when you think about just damage, right? When you think about just its damage against large targets, Warwalker's better. When you think about maneuverability, Warwalker's better. But when you think about what the Wave Serpent can possibly transport, the possible scout move you can do, the synergy between Corsairs and Wave Serpents, when you think about what the Wave Serpent can move block because of its big size, it could deal mortal wounds to something, potentially battle shock something. The Wave Serpent's actually much more comparable to the Warwalker in a lot of other ways. So yeah, Wave Serpent probably shouldn't be directly compared to a Warwalker, but I've heard people make this comparison before, like, well, why not just use a Warwalker for 110 points? Or, even when it was 120 points, it was like, well, why not just use a Warwalker? Well, I mean, obviously the Warwalker is different and is used differently than a Wave Serpent. That's why. They have different roles. But as far as their weapons go, the Wave Serpent's damage isn't that far behind the Warwalker to the point where it's like, oh, well, the Wave Serpent's garbage for its points, right? And the other thing about the Wave Serpent is it can transport 12 models. So you can throw 5 Corsairs in there, and then you can do the little trick where you scout up with it and then move Rangers back inside of it, which is an awesome trick that you can pull off. So, I think there's a lot of uses for the Wave Serpent outside of just damage. And, it may not be the most durable transport out there, but it certainly can get the job done, and it can get models where they need to be. And especially in a Mekdar style list where you have multiple of these things running around, I think it can be really effective as a mobile staging area for other units in your army to, then get out and attack either the mid board, your enemy's deployment zone, or the left or the right hand side of the battlefield. Okay, next up we have the Webway Gate. Of course, it's D tier. Not only is it bad because it's a fortification and GW hates fortifications now, but it is bad compared to other fortifications. It's like the worst fortification in the entire game. It's terrible. It does nothing for you. And in fact, it's actually a little bit of a detriment because it does count as a terrain piece that you have to move around. So it can actually block off charge lanes for you if you're not careful, or block off movement lanes if you deploy it poorly. So it sucks, guys. It's not worth it. Don't even think about it. But it is a cool terrain piece. And I think that if you already have it, definitely use that as a cool terrain piece. I think it's really cool if you use it as a terrain piece in the mid board. If you just put it in the middle of the board, like right on the center objective, and just don't count it as anything, right? Like don't count it as anything, but just have it as an aesthetic piece that's just there, that doesn't block movement or anything. It could be really cool. So. Okay, next up we have Wind Riders. Wind Riders, guys, I love them. They're an S tier for me. They just mulch most things in the game. They have such good damage numbers, especially when you combine them with all the synergies that they have available to them. and they're fast, they're hard-hitting, they benefit great from the stratagems that we have in our army. Even Bladestorm is pretty good on them, which Bladestorm is normally not good on Eldar units, but there you go. Bladestorm happens to be good on these guys. So, yeah, excellent unit. Can't say enough good things about it. It's just one of the best tools we have for dealing heavy damage against marine type equivalent enemies and for punching up into other targets with the help of Shroud Runners and a Farseer Skyrunner. Okay, next up. Oh, and by the way, the Overwatch is fantastic, right? Having sustained hits with the ability to reroll hits is amazing. A big unit of these guys with a Farseer Skyrunner and a Warlock can easily kill a 10-man unit of Achillans, deep striking in before they even get to attack and throw a grenade. So if you have one of these in your backfield, again, just like the 10-man unit of Dire Avengers I spoke of earlier, they will absolutely wreck those units. Next up is Wraithblades. Wraithblades, I kind of have to put in B tier, and I don't want to put them in B tier, but the problem with Wraithblades is, and I made a video about Wraithblades a while back, and if you're interested in learning how to use them properly, I would check out that video. But Wraithblades essentially are a unit that unless you leverage them properly to where they can threaten the enemy's backfield at the same time as they're controlling the midboard, they're just not going to be effective, and they're not going to be as good as the alternative, which is Wraith Guard. Now, the reason why this is primarily is because if you just sit them on an objective all game, unless you're running the rest of your army as an MSU style list that is using the Wraithblades as an anchor point, they're not going to do a lot for you. They're just going to sit on the objective. They're going to just get ignored, or they're going to just take so much damage that they eventually die, like over the course of a couple turns, right? Like there are a lot of units out there that can actually kill them if they're just sitting there doing nothing and not being proactive. So my advice, if you're going to use Wraithblades effectively, you got to be proactive with them. You got to make sure you put your opponent into a position where either they're letting you score those primary victory points, or, they're getting assaulted the next turn, right? And Wraithguard, or Wraithblades, excuse me, should always be used in a way that allows them to threaten adjacent objectives. So if you have the left-hand objective controlled by the Wraithblades, you should also be able to threaten the middle objective, right? You should be positioned in such a way that you can threaten the middle objective if your opponent moves anything on that piece of terrain. That way you could possibly score secondary objective points, right? Could possibly score things like cleanse and stuff like that. But at the same time, you're not just in a position where you're just sitting there doing nothing. And I guess that's my advice with them, is that I've seen some players, just sit them on the objective and just keep them there all game and be like, oh, well, it was worth the 400 points I spent on the unit just to score this, 20 VP or whatever on primary. And it's like, yeah, I can understand where you're coming from on that, but at the same time, it wasn't worth those points. You could have been doing more with the unit. Anyway, that's my spiel about Wraithblades. I think they can be very good, but, there's situations where you have to really be proactive with them, and you do have to position them correctly. Okay, Wraithguard are up next. They're going to be an A-tier unit. They share a spot with the Spiritseer because, honestly, they're just a really good control unit, even after all the nerfs and stuff like that. They are expensive, but they do hit extremely hard, and being able to potentially fire 3 times a turn, right, or 3 times a round, Overwatch, their normal shooting, and their ability, once they, get to fire back after being attacked, is really powerful. These guys can really rack up a lot of damage over the course of a couple turns. And they're very durable as well. Now, they do have their weaknesses, right? They're very weak against certain types of enemy damage, like devastating wounds. They're very weak against stuff with the anti-infantry effect. But in general, they can be really strong against, armies that are trying to control the midboard, because these guys have such high damage attacks. Wraith cannons are strength 14, AP -4, D6 damage apiece with devastating wounds. You got 10 of them. You're hitting on a 3+. Sometimes if, you have the right setup, you're going to be re-rolling all hits with the Farseer Skyrunner. -1 to wound with the Farseer. So these guys can really be super durable. They're super good at absorbing damage. And they can also be extremely potent at dealing damage back. And there's a reason why these guys are in a lot of competitive lists, even still. All right, let's talk about the Wraith Knight. So, the Wraith Knight, I'm going to go ahead and put in B tier. And again, I don't think the Wraith Knight is bad. I think it's situationally good. I actually think that the Wraith Knight can be used in competitive play and do quite well. Dual Wraith Cannons, dual heavy Wraith Cannons are a really powerful weapon option. Being able to deal that many devastating wounds, 2d6 devastating wounds to a target, is absolutely amazing. It can punch really hard against several different unit types. And if you look at units that can, normally ignore damage through invul saves or through, miracle dice and stuff like that, having something big like that be able to do so much devastating wounds in one attack is really strong. It's really good. And in some cases, you can actually do 4d6. You can roll your dice, you can get a natural 6, and you can use a command reroll, or you could even just use your normal Eldar reroll to put a 6 in there. And I guess you'd use the normal Eldar reroll, unless unless you already rolled a bunch of 6s, which in case you don't have to. But, you could change that into a 6 with a fate dice with a Farseer nearby, and you have 46 devastating wounds through to a target. That's going to destroy most vehicles in the game without a single save being rolled. So the Wraith Knight is really good. I think obviously the problem is it's expensive, right? It's 495 points. It's not very mobile. It's not as mobile as the Skothak Wraith Knight, right? But it does have more durability as well. So it is a little bit more durable with the -1 damage that it has. I still think the Wraith Knight's good. And even if you want to give it a Titanic Ghostglaive, I still think the Ghostglaive's a good option too. It's just probably a little less competitive just due to the way I think most people want to play a Wraith Knight, which is want to hang it back a little bit, kind of come out of terrain, shoot, move back, That's how people want to play with it. So I think that's probably the best way to use it. But if you want to use it as more of a bully type unit, yeah, give it a Titanic Ghostglaive. Throw it kind of near the center of the table where it's, behind obscuring terrain, but still, can still mix it up with enemy units and use it to capture objectives because it does have OC10. Okay, so that's the Wraith Knight. Let's look at the Wraith Lord. The Wraith Lord, I think, is also B tier. I think the Wraith Lord's still good, guys. And in fact, I'm almost thinking it's a little bit more A tier, but I'll just leave it in B tier. And here's, I think, the reason why, basically, is because it is a little bit unreliable, and a lot of people do kind of want to be able to know that they can hit, with Bright Lances usually. But I still love the Wraith Lord. I still think it could be good in competitive play. I just don't think it's the greatest pick in competitive play. And, basically a lot of our stuff is so expensive at this point. We did get a lot of point decreases, but there are still units that are expensive that, you may not be able to fit a Wraith Lord in your list. But I do think a Wraith Lord can be effective if used properly. I think obviously you want to give the Flamers. And I do want to make a mention of this really quick. I just listened to Bren's Craftworld Eldar video about Wraith Lords. And I was surprised that he is a fan of the Shuriken Catapult because it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me like the Flamers just do more damage against pretty much every target type out there than the Shuriken Catapults, especially when you consider that the Wraith Lord hits on 4+, and the Flamers are Torrent, so they auto-hit for you, ignoring cover. And yeah, the Shuriken Catapults have a little bit more range, but if you're using the Wraith Lord how it should be used in the midfield, I don't feel like the range is that big of a deal. But that's just me. I don't know. Tell me what you guys think in the comment section. Am I crazy, or are the Flamers just the better choice? Anyway, let me know in the comment section what you guys think about that. I think Flamers are just better in pretty much every circumstance, but I guess for that 1 out of 10 circumstance where the Flamers are not in range of something, being able to get 1 wound through with a 4+ save usually, or a 3+ save if the target's in cover, against an enemy unit, maybe that's slightly better than just not being able to shoot at all. I don't know. But anyway, that's my thought process on it. But yeah, you probably do want to give it the 2 Bright Lances. I also think alternatively, 2 shuriken cannons are not bad on it, but we have so many other shuriken cannon options in the index, it's probably just kind of redundant at that point. So, like for example, Wind Riders are going to be your shuriken cannon toters, right? Wraith Lords probably aren't as good with the shuriken cannon, so you probably just still want to give it the Bright Lance for that sweet Overwatch. But yeah, I think these guys can be good. They have good combat potential. They do hit on fours still, which kind of, it's swingy, but they're tough enough to where they could survive the counter blows from most units that they charge into. They also, of course, have good shooting with the 2 Bright Lances and 2 Flamers. They're durable enough. They have OC3, so they can kind of capture objectives. They can steal objectives away from transports, stuff like that. There's situations where I've had this guy, charge into something that I knew it couldn't kill just to contest an objective. You know, and by the way, strength 10 on the Ghostglaive, not the best for killing things that are, toughness 10 or toughness 11, but it'll kill a rhino. It'll deal some good damage to a rhino. And again, it may not even kill the rhino, but it'll do decent damage to it. So, well, let me tell you a little story. One time, there was this one game I was playing where I was playing with a Wraith Lord, and my buddy moved up a rhino transport onto an objective. And I remember him saying something along the lines of, well, if you kill it, I'll control the objective, right? Something cheeky like that. And basically what I did is I didn't really have anything in charge range except a Wraith Lord. And he overestimated the Wraith, or, well, I guess didn't overestimate, he underestimated the Wraith Lord's ability to not deal damage. So basically what I did is instead of choosing to use the strength 10, I just chose to use the strength 7. I didn't do almost any damage to the rhino, and the Wraith Lord had 3 OC, whereas the rhino only had 2 OC. So I ended up controlling that objective and scoring points on it because my opponent, failed to recognize that, I had a sweep attack that I could just choose to not deal much damage with. Right. So, yeah, there's situations where Wraith Lords have definitely, their lack of damage against vehicles potentially has helped me. But, they can also swing pretty hard with the strength 10 against stuff that is toughness 9, so they're not as bad as they look in combat against certain targets. Okay, next is the rates here. I think the rates here, again, not great. C tier, overpriced, really doesn't have as much damage as the Wraith Lord in any way, shape, or form in both melee and range, and has a few other keywords that make him weaker against certain targets. So he has a Psyker keyword, which makes him weaker against Psyker, anti-Psyker abilities. So, his weapon is anti-infantry and has precision, but why would you need precision on this guy when he's hitting on a 4+ and his weapon isn't super, super strong? I just think there's better precision models in the game, like the Solitaire, for a cheaper cost. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of the rates here, and unfortunately the rates here is going to be going the way of the Dodo soon as well. Okay, Yin Karn. Now the Yin Karn, I think, is probably A tier. It's still good, but it's been nerfed so many times now that I think it's probably even on the lower side of A tier. Because of all the nerfs, there's a lot of things your opponents could do now to prevent the Yin Karn from actually being able to get into the targets it wants to get into. It's really expensive at 350. The Avatar of Cain is 15 points less at 335. The Yin Karn doesn't hit as hard as the Avatar of Cain. The Yin Karn is not as durable as the Avatar of Cain. And even though it's more mobile in a way, it depends on you being able to kill the right unit in the right position to be able to then chain off of it. And I just don't think it's worth it in general. I'm not a big fan of the Yin Karn right now. But, I mean, again, I'm not a big Yin Karn enjoyer in general. I've only played the Yin Karn probably about 4 or 5 times this edition with different lists. I haven't used it a ton, but, it's one of those models now where I think there's even less of an ability to really get in there in the right way. So being able to make a charge when you have to place the center of your model over the center of the last enemy model destroyed can be a little bit insane when you're destroying a unit and perhaps your opponent chooses to remove the last model of the unit at the very end of where you need to be. So I wish I could show you what this looks like, but just assume that there's a unit spread out over this area and your charge target's over here. and your opponent just chooses to select the last model as something over here. So now your Yin Karn has to go over here, center to center, and that's a long charge now, and you're probably not going to make it. So I don't know. I just don't think the Yin Karn is as effective as it has been in the past. Okay, now we have Prince Riel. Prince Riel, I got to put him in C tier. It's not because I want to. I think he's really cool. I just don't think he has the greatest damage in the world. And he's 100 points. He does allow you to redeploy. But the unfortunate thing about the redeploy is that it's done before deciding who goes first. So it doesn't really help you a whole lot. It helps you with certain builds. Like there's certain builds where he can actually be pretty decent. But it's because of the way you deploy units in 10th edition, it's also not that big of a deal because you can essentially kind of use your smaller units first to infiltrate up the battlefield, kind of bait your opponent into placing their more important units after that. And you can kind of get a better idea of where your opponent's deploying. So redeployment abilities are not generally as good unless you know who's going first or second. So yeah, I'm going to put him in C tier. But, he's probably not going to be in the codex, unfortunately. So that's a real shame as well. I do like Prince Riel. I did like him in the beginning of the edition, but he's definitely not as good nowadays. Okay. Anyway, Yvraine. Yvraine is A tier. Now, in the past, I probably would have put this model in S tier, but 125 points. She's really only good in Harlequin units, big units of Harlequins. Possibly Corsair Void Scarred, but better in Harlequin units. And she's kind of expensive. I personally think she's good. She's definitely A tier. She's definitely included in a lot of lists, but she's not included anywhere outside of just running that big Harlequin brick. So I think that does say a lot. I think obviously she's really good in the Harlequin brick, but outside of that brick, I don't think she's that effective. And, the Vizark, for example, is, I would say, a little bit more versatile because he can actually be used in units of small units of Quins in a Falcon and still be effective. But Yvraine really can't do that effectively. I think she's best in the big Harlequin units, perhaps even in a Wave Serpent. But I have to say, she is good. She has a great anti-infantry attack, which clears a lot of infantry out. She has a really good weapon in melee combat with devastating wounds, so she is good in combat as well. She's not very durable. She's kind of awkward because her base size is, kind of weird. But she has a big booty. So, that kind of makes up for it, I think. And that's really what I think brings her up to A tier, is the power of the booty. So we'll just leave it at that. But yeah, this is what I think about where the Eldar are at in general. There's a couple of things that are different from last time, like Shining Spears, for example. I think are a little bit up there in comparison to where they were last time. I think I had them in B tier, maybe even C tier last time. And there's been a couple of changes here and there, but for the most part, things have remained relatively the same. I think this is going to be my last tier list unless something drastic happens before the codex comes out. I think this is going to be the last tier list until 2025. So, overall, I think, my experience with the Eldar and the changes that they've gone through over the edition has been a mixed bag. I think, GW did really overhit them at certain points in the edition and just over nerf. But then, they kind of buffed a lot of units that, kind of made there be different play styles and kind of opened up some different avenues of play and strategies and different lists that have really been interesting, especially as the edition wore on and as the Eldar became less and less of the focus of competitive play. So, is the Eldar index in a good state at the moment? I would say yes. I would say it's probably in the best state it's been the whole edition. Now, that doesn't mean competitively effective, but it means the most balanced, right? I think it's in the most balanced state it has been since the beginning of the, edition. Okay, just kidding, guys. We have one more, and that is the Warwalker. So, forgot to put this in here, but yes, the Warwalker is indeed one of the best units in the index. It's definitely an S tier unit, and primarily that comes down to having the ability to scout, to make those turn 1 alpha strikes, or controversially, being able to, if you don't go first, hide and get a good position on the battlefield while, potentially baiting out your opponent into the middle of the board and being able to lock down those firing lanes. I think the Warwalker is probably one of the best platforms in the entire Aeldari index. It's really strong. 2 Bright Lances being able to both overwatch and, being able to shoot down range is good. It's also fairly durable against both small arms fire and, bigger hits with the assistance of Fade dice because, you have that 4+ invul save. So it's surprisingly durable for the, cost that it is. The only thing I would say about the Warwalker probably is, and it's not really technically a bad thing, but it is really weak to mortal wounds. Like, there are things in the game that can just, throw, like, for example, Doombolt can almost kill it in one shot. And, it's not that durable against that type of stuff. And if you do miss your 4+ invul save, you don't have the Fate dice for it, one last cannon can pretty much take it out if they roll a 5+. So that's also not great. It's also not great against things that can just mulch down tougher targets. Like, for example, autocannons are really good against this. Things like, autocannon type equivalents. Anything with a flat damage 3, like a Leman battle tank or a battle cannon or something like that, is really good against these things. Whereas, a Wraith Lord might be a little bit more survivable. A Wave Serpent might be a little bit more survivable because they have more wounds, so they can kind of absorb those hits, but unfortunately the Warwalker cannot. So that's the only complaint I really have about it, but I mean, that's not a big deal. We all know it's fragile, and we all work around that anyway, so yeah. The Warwalker, definitely still an S tier, primarily because of its high mobility, scout, and the ability to take 2 very efficient Bright Lances. But it's also good because of its, kind of Fox durability, in that it has -1 to wound against range attacks, and it has a 4+ invul save. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching. Sorry that I was, coughing a little bit here and there throughout the video. I have been sick, but I did want to really make this video for you guys today because we're going to be moving on to some interviews later this week and getting ready for Worlds, Warhammer Worlds. So get ready for that. I hope you guys are excited for some sick Aeldari lists that are going to be participating in it. I hope to cover a lot of these lists in a future video, as well as, interview a player that is going to be in Worlds itself and going to be playing in it with the Scorpion. So, which is really cool. A super heavy tank, one of the last times it's ever going to be seen in competitive play. Let's go, and it's going to be a great time. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last 2 years. Your help has greatly been appreciated, and it has improved the channel immensely. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials on my Patreon activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who like talking about strategies, tactics, and of course hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar minis on Amazon, or perhaps some, Eldar inspired apparel on the channel store page, rep your, favorite faction or aspect warrior at your local game store, check out the store and check out the affiliate links. All right, everybody, that's going to be it. I'll see you guys later, and have a good one. Peace out, everybody.